Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a meeting of the Hunterdon Central Regional High School Board of Education. Please be advised that this and all meetings of the board are open to the public and media consistent with the Open Public Meetings Act and JSA 10:4-6, and that advance notice required therein has been provided. Meeting notice was also posted in the boardroom of the Upper School campus, sent to the Courier News, Star Ledger, Express Times, and the Hunterdon County Democrat, and sent to the clerks of Delaware Township, East Amwell Township, Flemington Borough, Raritan Township, and Reddington Township. The public will have an opportunity to be heard as shown on the agenda. Can I have a roll call, please?
Mrs. Blutfield? Here. Dr. Charney?
Here.
Mr. Davidson?
Here.
Mr. Fowler?
Here.
Mrs. Kellogg? Here. Mr. Nickel?
Here.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Here.
Mr. Richard?
Here.
And Mrs. Hughes?
Here. Can we all please rise for the flag salute? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone. Can I have a motion for approval of the June 1st, 2022 minutes?
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, can I have a roll call vote, please?
Mrs. Blutfield?
Yes.
Dr. Charney?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Abstain.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg?
Yes.
Mr. Nickel?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mr. Richard?
Yes.
And Mrs. Hughes?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
Thank you. Now I need a motion for approval of the June 13th minutes.
So moved. Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, can I have a roll call vote, please?
Mrs. Blutfield?
Yes.
Dr. Charney?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg? Mr. Nickel?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mr. Richard?
Yes.
And Mrs. Hughes?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
Thank you. Okay, last one. I need a motion for June 27th minutes, please.
So moved. Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Can I have a roll call vote, please?
Mrs. Blutfield?
Abstain.
Dr. Charney?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Abstain.
Mrs. Kellogg? Yes. Mr. Nickel?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mr. Richard?
Yes.
And Mrs. Hughes?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
Thank you. We have one item of correspondence as noted on the agenda. And with that, we'll move right into Dr. Moore's report.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We have something important to mark tonight on the agenda, which is motion asking you to ratify the new Hunterdon Central Education Association contract. The HCEA is the largest bargaining unit that we have, and after really a good, thorough conversation over the course of the year and lots of good faith cooperation and conversation, I want to thank Mrs. Hughes, Ms. Blutfield, Mr. Richard, and Mr. Nickel, who served on that committee. And I want to thank the leadership of the HCEA also. It was another round of positive negotiations. And with their approval of the contract, it now comes to you for approval. We can talk about it more as we get into the personnel section, but the average settlement over 5 years, now a 5-year contract is a wonderful thing. The average settlement over 5 years is 3.3% increase on salary, and you've all seen all the documents that I've shared with the nuts and bolts. We'll have the final version of the actual document coming very soon, and that'll be on our website for everybody to see as well. So I'm really pleased to continue in that what I hope is a good tradition of fruitful conversation on contract ratification with the association. We have also tonight one HIB for motion after my report's concluded. This is an incident that I reported to you in closed session back on June 27th. So that D1 will need a vote for us tonight. Now, I do want to ask us to move to some seats in the audience. Mr. Brandt and I have some presentation material to share with you, and we're going to have to use the screen. So if we can take a minute just to wander down there. I shared a PDF with all of you as well, so you do have a PDF of it, but the screen's going to come down right on top of us. So it would be best if we move down to the seats. So if you don't mind relocating, I'm going to get myself settled down there, and then we'll dive in. Sorry, get me back to you guys. So I'll go ahead and get started, and we'll dive into the slides in a moment. But what I wanted to present with Mr. Brandt tonight are some findings, lessons learned, and some information from this year's Climate and Culture Surveying. There we go. It's coming up now. And we had a very comprehensive climate and culture survey project this year that is giving us a lot to chew on and a lot of directionals for our next steps going into next school year. So we're going to talk about some of that today and go through some different findings and some different opportunities for next steps in this analysis as well. So the first thing to note is that we have, on any given day, about 2,600 students. So this survey went out to all of them. We ended up with 1,458 responses, about 56%, which is an excellent return on a survey like this. I'm going to ask Mr. Brandt to come up and chat a bit about some of the other implementation maneuvers we went through and some of the other numbers that we got back.
Thank you. Yeah, so one thing to point out, too, is that this survey, creating the survey and putting together was a key step also in this process. We had surveys that we had run from 2 previous school years that were successful in giving us information, and they were surveys that were Rutgers Department of Ed collaborated to produce a survey that's available for all schools. And it's written in a K-12 setting atmosphere as well. So coming out of those surveys, we felt, you know what, between the fact that it was written for K-12 and also some of the work we've been focusing on, specifically anti-bias efforts, we felt that we needed a survey that had a little bit more connection with with the information we need from our students. So throughout the winter months, we elicited feedback from students, from staff members, and from parents in what items in that previous survey we can remove, what blanks, what voids were in the survey that we can fill, and what type of questions actually do you wish you were asked that we're not asking here. And then we put together then a survey for both students, which we had over 1,400 students reply. We also had, and one element is we added interviews as well. So part of the survey was if students were interested in being interviewed, so that we can dive a little deeper in some of the prompts. 75 students said that yes, they'd be interested in being interviewed, and we interviewed 65 of them. It was great. Also, we had a survey for staff. Approximately 250 of our staff members completed the survey, and we also had a survey for family members, parents, and they were all pushed out during that same early April time period. We had only about 220 parents reply and fill it out. So one of the things that we also, aside from what Dr. Moore is going to lead through here about the student survey, we want to figure out what's a better way to get more parents involved in giving us feedback that we need. Going back to the students, again, over 1,400 responses. It was fantastic that we got that. But it also, in the work of putting it together and not getting the survey out to the students until April, it didn't give us a lot of time to compile the results of all the surveys. So we felt as a committee, let's finish the school year out strong and focus on the student survey first so that we could share back those results with the students before, especially before the seniors graduated, and also to get feedback that would help us through the summer to design, make improvements, tweaks to our practices going into the school year. So that kind of gives you, in a nutshell, the flow of it. We do still have work to do, not only for this, and Dr. Moore is going to talk more about it, but also with the staff and the parent-family survey. That is the next step in getting that information back into the hands of all the constituents, and so we can make changes as we see fit based on that. I'll pass it back to you.
So one of the points in there is, surveys are always imperfect by themselves. They give you directionals. You end up having to kind of use other kinds of methods, interviews, focus groups. That takes more time, and then as you begin to implement some things, taking all of that information as directionals, you're continuing those conversations to see how you're doing. So the information we have to share tonight is of a directional kind of pointers for us. But there are some things that rise out of this survey as real clear themes and real important lessons learned as we move into the 22-23 school year. So, Mr. Brandt mentioned, we had given 2 prior surveys based on the the New Jersey Department of Education climate survey that was developed with Rutgers. And even though these surveys were different from the one that we gave just this past spring, there are enough key questions that are similar that we were able to track some trends. And there are about 19 or 20 questions that are nearly identical out of the whole survey, and we could track trends on those. Everything else represented additional questions for deeper information that we were adding in this year with Mr. Brandt's committee and all of the feedback he was receiving from students and parents driving that effort. So some challenges have emerged as we look at those questions across multiple years. So that handful of questions, those 20 or so questions that we can trace through all 3 surveys, and that's the 18-19, 19-20, and then 21-22 school years. So we did not administer a climate culture survey in 2021. So the first, majority of our students indicate on a common question across these 3 surveys that their peers stand up to help them. That's one of the prompts. Do your peers stand up to help you when necessary? But that total percentage has fallen from the first administration of the survey. So when we first administered this survey, when we were posting for our 4 years of kids about something in the 80s, we were getting positive response on that. That's fallen a bit since the initial administrations of the survey. That points to work that we have to do, and all of these things point to work that we have to do that I'll start covering as we continue through. Majority of students report that their families encourage them to do well in school, but that, interestingly, has fallen somewhat significantly from prior surveys. So where we were seeing upwards of almost 100% of students reporting that, we saw a drop there. We also saw a majority feeling that they can express themselves, but that's also fallen a bit over the past couple of years. so since the initial survey. So we're seeing clear indications of work that we need to do with our students and our families to reconnect, and as we come out of the strange few years that we've been through, a need to focus more on how we can move day to day through some of the challenges that are being shown here. Majority of our students feel safe at school, but that's fallen just a tiny bit. I'm going to talk about that in more detail later on. I bring that up here because I want to point at some particular areas where that's shifted a bit. But vast majority of students are feeling safe at school. Majority report that the school addresses mental health. That's also fallen a bit, and that speaks certainly to the work that we've had to do to understand different kinds of mental health support that our students need at this time, certainly coming out of the pandemic. And I want to continue to speak optimistically about coming out of the pandemic. We also saw positive changes in the survey over those three years. So it wasn't all about declines. We also have positive changes. So our students have been asked questions about cheating on assignments over the course of these 3 surveys, and that's increased considerably over the life of these surveys. So we've gone up to 84% of students reacting unfavorably to cheating, and that's a testament certainly to the work that our teachers are doing in creative assigning, creative assessment. Majority report that their teachers encourage them. That's also increased significantly over the life of the 3 surveys that we've given. And we have a majority of students reporting that they overall, looking back over the course of the school year, they enjoy school, and that's an increase from prior surveys as well. Now, those lessons that I talked about, those analyses of changes over time, come from looking at the survey and looking how answers clump. And so some example of how that works, if we are able to turn survey responses into a scaled score. So let's say your survey response, depending on how positive or negative it is, gets a score of 0 to 4, and then we start to look at, all right, well, where's our target response area? We want to see on this particular question responses at a 2 or higher. That becomes our target response area. We want to see more and more responses at 2 or higher. You know, you can see survey responses might clump in certain ways. And so when we look at it this way, that's where we get something like, oh, a majority of students, 57%, 84%, whatever percent of students answered in a positive way as opposed to in a negative way, or vice versa. You know, X percentage of students answered in a challenging way to us. So that's how we look at how survey responses clump to get the information that I just shared. But there's another whole way to look at this. And that's where we do averages. Averages are of little value by themselves when you're looking at the whole survey. What was the average score of each question is hard to really understand or get a lot of information from, because you could have vastly different scenarios that provide the same average. So, you know, clumping like this would provide the exact same average score as clumping like that, but they tell 2 very different stories, right? So students answering in this way are split on the extreme ends of a question, and that's an important thing for us to know. Students here are clumped in the middle, and that's an important thing for us to know, and so therefore those are 2 very different scenarios. We can use averages. They're more valuable, not perfect, but they're more valuable when we start disaggregating the data into different groups. So when we start comparing the responses of different groups. And different averages there can signal potential different leanings in the results. And that's where we get to now looking at some of the issues that Mr. Brandt was talking about that we wanted to capture in this survey. Differences based on identity and background and all different sorts of demographics to understand where might there be differences in how people are experiencing the school here. So different average signals pointing to different leaning. I can give an example for a question, say, where, I don't know, males answer in this distribution, but females might answer in this distribution. That's just an example pulled out of the air here. Those are 2 very different stories. So this answer leans in one direction, this answer leans toward a more positive direction, and therefore we need to know that that different kinds of people are having different experiences and answering on average in different ways. But again, it's not perfect. It's still just directional information. Focus groups and all that additional work that Mr. Brandt talked about help us get deeper into understanding here. So let's talk about that a little bit. Using that kind of analysis now, comparing averages, comparing average scores, we can start to look at different experiences of belonging here at Central based on a lot of the other questions that are in the survey. So the survey asks students to identify their grade. That's one dimension that we can look at. Ask them to identify their race and ethnicity, and ask them whether or not they're a member of the school's LGBTQ+ community. Those were three dimensions that that the committees and folks wanted to focus on in the analysis of these survey results. So this was an anonymous survey, totally anonymous, but we captured these demographic data on each student respondent. So the grades that were reported pretty evenly across all 4 grades. So 9th through 12th grade, we were fairly even across all 4 grades, adding up to 1458 responses. The races and ethnicities reported, now this adds up to something higher than 1458. Again, students could pick multiple ethnicities, but some students also preferred not to answer this question at all. But you can see where different races and ethnicities were identified here and the numbers of students in each. The point to make on this is when you analyze these results, we had about 439 of survey respondents were Black, Indigenous, or people of color, so BIPOC students. And what that indicates, 30%, that's higher than what we've talked about in our other demographic analyses. In our other demographic analyses, we've been using terms like 1 in 4. We've been talking about 25%. So this survey is showing the respondents, at least, are reaching toward more 30% of people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color. So you have all of this now broken down in the survey results. LGBTQ plus identification, we had 223 students identify as yes, 1135 identifying as no, and 100 declining to answer. We removed those 100 out of the analysis for that group because we couldn't determine certainly where they might identify. But when you look at 223 out of our population of survey respondents, that's about 15%, and that mirrors what we've seen in other surveys as well. So 15% is a number that's come up in several measurements here for the size of our LGBTQ plus student population. So when we analyze results, now we can break down the results by all those dimensions. And this is how that started to look to us. When we analyzed the results by grade level, we generally saw similar responses across each grade level. There weren't a lot of differences. So what freshmen said, sophomores said, juniors, seniors said, it was all very similar. There might have been some differences, but for the most part, it was all very similar. However, the way that they answered across multiple questions presented some interesting opportunities for us to dig in. So we found, for example, 9th and 12th graders were more consistently positive, way more consistently positive. When you do color mapping, when you do heat maps on them, it's bright green and bright green for 9th and 10th or 9th and 12th graders. Way more positive responses than 10th and 11th graders in general. That's something we have to dig into and understand, well, why is that? It's not a finding or a conclusion that we could say is any more than a guess right now, but it's not lost on us, certainly, that our 9th and our 12th graders were the only class cohorts that had full in-person introductions to the school over the past several years. That's not lost on us as a factor in this, but I can't share that as a conclusion. I share that just as a right now. 10th graders in general gave the least positive responses on this survey, which, again, when you look at the heat mapping, there's a lot of red in their column as the lowest numbers in their groups, even though the numbers across the rows weren't significantly different. We also noted 10th graders feeling unsafe in 2 particular areas. 2 particular areas came up, and they came up primarily for 10th graders: hallways, lavatories. We'll talk about that in a little bit, too, as it informs our next steps. More often than other students in other grades. Now, remember what I said earlier, the vast majority of students in the survey said that they felt comfortable in all areas. felt safe in all areas, but these two areas popped a little bit for our 10th graders. It's also curious because our 9th and 10th graders share the same facilities. They're in the 9-10 building, yet the 10th graders had a different response than the 9th graders did. So that's something that we have to understand. Finally, 10th graders reported feeling more likely to experiencing bullying than students in other grades. 9th graders actually reported the lowest likelihood of being bullied, which it was an interesting finding for us as well, because we don't typically expect to see that in our youngest grades. We expect our youngest grades to be working through some of those things a little bit more, but they reported the lowest likelihood. So as that played out across grades, that's what that looked like. Now, when we look at race and ethnicity and LGBTQ plus identification, we see other clear areas, next levels of work for us here at Hunterdon Central. On average, our BIPOC, our Black, Indigenous, and people of color, our BIPOC students are less likely to report being involved in clubs and activities. And you can see where, again, we're taking averages, and averages are tough to look at except when we're looking at differences. But when you see the difference there, our students of color and Black, Indigenous students, 1.71 average score on questions about extracurricular activities, while our white students scored 2.1% average. So our BIPOC students were less likely to report being involved in clubs and activities. We don't have, by the way, and traditionally we don't have great census taking around our clubs and activities. That has to change. We've talked about that quite a bit, that we have to have a better handle on the membership of those clubs and activities so that we can continue to track that. Less likely to report, yeah. No. No, well, yes, actually, yes. Yes, it does. In the framing of the question, yes, it does. We have a better accounting of sport rosters, yeah. On average, students feeling that staff and students treat people fairly. This was also different. Our BIPOC students averaging 2.39 on being treated fairly by staff, while white students were 2.75, and then lower for students in general. And that's something to point out there, is that the highest score, 2.21, for how fairly students treat each other was lower than the lowest score for staff. So students are recognizing, I think, one thing we might be able to say from this, again, we need to dig deeper, students are recognizing the work that staff members are doing to address this specifically in classes and other places, but they're finding it less expansive through their peers as it is through staff members. On average, less likely to report connecting with an adult or belonging at Central. And you can see those differences there, averages of 1.38 versus 1.59, and averages of 1.55 versus 2.22. These are the most significant differences. There are other differences in some of the questions, but I picked the ones here for you that had the largest amount of difference, that were closest to being potentially significant. Now, our LGBTQ plus students basically reported the same kinds of trends, but they had some additional information for us about their experience that was different from Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So we had, on average, students in the LGBTQ plus community, again, that's 15% based on this survey, less likely to report feeling like they matter to others. And that's an expansive question. It wasn't feeling matter to others necessarily in school, right? It was to matter to others, period. So this is an interesting and troubling finding, or a troubling piece of data, that there's a difference of, fairly wide difference between those two answers. Less likely, LGBTQ plus students, less likely to report enjoying school. Less likely to report that students help one another, and that's a very large difference in average score there. 1.96 versus 2.23 is pretty large. Less likely to report that they're comfortable expressing themselves. And again, you can see where this fits into some of the larger results that we talked about earlier, where scores like students feeling able to express themselves moving down a little bit over the course of the surveys. And now we find these differences among groups. It helps us target our responses to close those gaps. And then less likely, or more likely to report, in this case, more likely to report likelihood of experiencing bullying. And the board has seen that in HIB cases this year, where they involved accusations of bias. And you can see that they averaged lower toward the desired response of not experiencing bullying, less so than their non-LGBTQ plus peers. And that's a fairly large difference as well there. So we have next steps to think about in response to all of these initial findings. I want to piggyback a little bit on what Mr. Brandt said. There's more understanding to gain. This is the first of several conversations that we're going to have both in Student Life and Program and in other committees, and also here about the results of not just this survey, but also continued work on the parent survey, which had a very small turnout. We need to bulk that up with some additional investigation, and the staff survey as well. So all of those have to fit in here as well to give us the full story. Right now we have some directionals. And based on other data that we've talked a lot about discipline data this year and different discipline concerns from this past school year. We have some clear next steps as we head into next school year, even though we're continuing the investigation. So we know, based on the data that we've seen, that staff training on relationship building has to continue, because we saw some, we're not satisfied with the level at which students are reporting that they have a close connection with an adult here. We need to see that come up, and we need to see that come up in a culturally competent way. So anti-bias education needs to continue as well. Our students who identify in different gender and sexual identities, our students who belong to different racial ethnic communities, different religious communities, need to feel that connection as well. We also note the very big differences between how students talk about fair treatment from staff and fair treatment from their peers. And that points us towards the need to continue to extend conversations about relationship building and bias to students. Much more explicit and direct instruction about that. We've started some of that this year. You've heard about that through some of the departmental supervisory conversations that we've had, but we see a continued need to be extra explicit about that. Mr. Brandt and his team and folks have talked about leveraging activity blocks a lot more deliberately for that, and in that too, expanding mentorship opportunities between kids. Sources of Strength, which is an organization Mr. Brandt has spearheaded over the past couple of years, is now at a size and strength and has capacity to be able to move forward on a lot of those campaigns, along with a lot of other student organizations that have been focusing on providing kids safe spaces to give us feedback and also to relate to one another. So we've got to leverage all of that much more deliberately next year. Sharing and cooperation with parents and the larger community. There's a lot of talk right now as we move into the school year about shared decision-making and broader communication. And a lot of times that conversation is about administration and staff engaging in shared decision-making and broader communication, but that extends out to all of our other stakeholders as well: students, parents, other community members, members of different community organizations that are trying to do important work in our community, all different kinds of folks across our school landscape. And here, again, Mr. Brandt has spent a lot of work this past year, has done a lot of work this past year on connecting with parents to design not a PTA, not a PTO, but something different to exist in this landscape of governance and policy and improvement. And so we're looking forward to that coming out to everybody in the fall as well. Students, and again, including just students in discussions on governance and policymaking. One of the things on the agenda tonight is first read for the state-mandated policy around student members of the Board of Education. But a lot of districts will do that by having a student sit at the Board of Education table and deliver a report like we've done here. Students come to this podium, deliver a report, and they let us know what's going on. We imagine and envision something that's a lot more robust in terms of our student organizations, whether it's student council augmented by other organizations of students, or whether it's a change in the way student council operates. We envision that students can be brought into governance and policymaking discussions a lot more often and a lot more deliberately, to have more ownership. One of the questions in the survey, which didn't come up as a significant change over the years, was, do you feel like you can help make decisions in the school? And we've never been satisfied with the level that our students report there. So this is a good time to move forward. Including students in discussions on governance and policymaking is including our chief clients in having a voice at the table for all of the things that are being done around and for them. Increased campus security. Now, this is in response to all sorts of things, but particularly thinking about where students have reported feeling unsafe on campus. In particular, I pointed out 10th graders talking about the bathrooms, talking about the hallways. On the agenda tonight is a motion to ask for your approval to secure a third Class 3 officer from Raritan Township. They're ready to vote on that as well, which means that with your approval and the town council's approval, we can move forward on bringing in a third Class 3 officer. We're ready for that expense. We've seen it. The police have talked to us. Our partners in law enforcement have talked to us about the need to have some additional help on campus, not just because of things that happen on campus, but because across our community, they've had many, many, many more interactions with youth over the prior 2 years than they've had in years before that. And I'm not just talking about in school, I'm talking about out of school as well. So there's a ripe opportunity there for greater partnership with them, and they're some of our best partners at Raritan Township PD. And lastly, in our conversation tonight, there are some things that we need to really firm up on in terms of cell phone use. And I know we've talked about where social media has played a role in a lot of the problems that we've had between students, in students' awareness of and use of social media, dangers, responsibilities, and everything that comes with it. We need here to think differently about how cell phones are used in school. Right now, our policy allows us to take stricter approaches to that. And I don't mind using that word, and I don't use it lightly or accidentally. Stricter approaches is something that we need to do here. Not just because social media is in the background of a lot of the interactions that are troubling between students that we've seen, but also because social media has been a significant distraction to our students. One thing I can tell you, for example, is in our policy, during class time, it is forbidden for students to use cell phones without the permission of their teacher. But one of the things that can happen is a student can leave the room to go to the lavatory, and if they have their cell phone with them, they're using their cell phone during class time. It's time to start reading that policy and enacting that policy to the letter. During class time, from bell to bell, cell phones will not be permitted out in the open, no matter where a student is. Lunchtime, passing time, these are times when a teacher might say to students, I need you to use your phones for X, Y, or Z if they're doing a Quizlet or something on the phone, or if there's often students are doing different recordings for assignments. Those are times when teachers are directing and allowing cell phones to be out. But we need to, and we can do that right away because that's in our policy, but we also need to begin to talk with students and parents about a better policy. It's time to update that policy and face facts about what the reliance upon these devices is creating for our children. One of the things that I think about here, we do our monthly Student of the Month luncheons, and we use that as an opportunity to poll them and talk to them. It's a diverse group of kids. They've been recognized for all kinds of goodness, not just good course grades. They've been helpful. And I've been popping in and out of classrooms with questions like this too. I ask our students in all of these contexts, how many of you want to use your phones less than you do? And I ask them to close their eyes so they can't see each other raising their hands. How many of you want to use your phones less than you do? And 70 to 80% of our students raise their hands. They want it. And in their most honest moments, they're telling us that. I see it with my own children. I see it with me. I see it with all of us. It's time for us, as we come out of the pandemic and celebrate in-person, face-to-face engagement, that we put our rules and our structures behind that as well, and be very deliberate. And though it may feel strict as it begins, we have to be very deliberate about expecting that among our students. And we feel that that will go a long way towards the relationship building that we're trying to be explicit about elsewhere. So we will see that as we come into the school year as well, in our communications coming into the 22-23 school year, that our stance on phones is going to shift to meet the challenges that we've seen. So much more to come. I opened by talking about how there's directionals here. Did I miss anything in that sort of next steps? Thanks. Talked about directionals, talking about needing to dig deeper, talking about needing to talk to more folks. We have more sets of data to bring into this, but from what we've been able to analyze so far, those are the steps that we see ourselves able to take as soon as next school year. So with that, I am done with my report, unless there are questions for me from any of the board members on any of that information. Yes, Dr. Charney?
It's a very comprehensive report, and I think it's valuable to compare 3 years. One concern I have, and I've expressed it before, is the construct of the survey. This is a Likert survey. You have 5 choices. And studies have shown that most takers of these surveys will gravitate to the middle.
Yeah.
So that's a 2 out of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Do you have any data of how many students or respondents chose a 2 in the survey?
Well, so the questions, there were some questions that had 4 choices, some questions that had 5 choices. And we didn't see a trend necessarily. I would have to go take a look, though, in answer to your specific question. We didn't see a trend in the numbers of kids sitting in the middle, but we did, as we were analyzing it and certainly comparing it to prior years where everything was 4 choices, we did come out of that going, from now on, we ought to do 4 choices. Even though it forces folks, and you and I have had that conversation, that's my preference as well. We allowed the committee to make some design decisions there, but I think that one of the lessons learned is that it did produce some difficulties in analysis, particularly when we were trying to compare to previous years.
So do you have that sense that there may have been some difficulty in analysis with this survey because of the choice construct?
We don't, I mean, I can only guess at that right now, but that is something that we're working through in our follow-up focus groups with kids as well, is if we're finding a question where a lot of people landed in the middle, trying to tease out some more information. There were also some narrative sections of this survey that as we tap that stuff back into the data, we can make some finer adjustments to where some people landed. But yeah, at this point, it is that's why it's just a directional at this point, because we haven't gotten to the point of really teasing through all of that sort of middle ground.
I actually have another question about the cell phone use. How do we enforce cell phone use in classroom?
So teachers are responsible for enforcing cell phone use in classroom, and right now, under our policy, teachers can allow students or even ask students to use cell phones to complete specific assignments, or allow them to use cell phones while they're taking a break. This is work that we have to do with teachers to make sure that we're all on the same page about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. The key concern we have is where students in class or during class time are using cell phones. A lot of the discipline issues that we've seen have involved communication between students in those kinds of contexts. And that's what we're trying to kind of put a little bit of barrier in on, so that we can make everybody aware that you've got to step back and be more responsible in the use of these devices. So teachers working with us through the summer and into the fall, we're going to have to make sure that we've got clear, consistent rules, that there are some things that teachers need to maybe be more consistent on as they look at the cell phone policy. Everybody here is going to be responsible for helping to enforce that. I think teachers are ready for it. We've heard a lot from our staff in terms of complaints about this issue as well.
So my suggestion on this is, I've been in districts that have a cell phone sleeve at the front of the building, and everybody disarms as they go into class. So it's a numbered sleeve. I don't think you can enforce a possession cell phone use with students. One thing they're very good at is hiding their texting and being as surreptitious as anyone can imagine. I would hate to put a teacher in a position where he or she is having to challenge 30% of the students in the class about cell phone usage. So I think if you establish procedures from the get-go, then it's out of the teacher's enforcement hands. So I, as a board member, I would like to see that direction.
Yeah. Well, and there are things, I appreciate that, thank you. There are things within the boundaries of our current policy that we can do, and there are things that we would feel most comfortable doing with a revised policy. And so a big conversation as we begin to move through this is, where do we want to revise our policy so that it gives us all the force behind us that we need to enact whatever it is that we might want to. The other thing too, the other side of it there isn't just enforcement, but it's also explicit instruction and practicing of interactions without the phone. You know, we've had different community organizations come in over the years and do sort of put down your phone and talk lunches, where they incentivized, you know, students during unit lunch to put down their phones and have conversations. And, you know, those worked well. That's got to be part of the answer. That and enforcement, plus all of the community conversation to get to a consistent approach, with some hope that at home we're having some help as well. All of that together we feel can make a dent. Any one of those things by themselves is going to be trouble and isn't going to get us far enough, I think. So full court press on that next year. Yes, Noah? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So there are things, you know, that jump to mind about how we can ensure representation across all different dimensions of sort of demographics in our student government. But one of the key things that sits behind all of that is there's also an electoral process for student government. And so we're trying to, you know, I think there's got to be some way that we respect both of those things. There's the exercise of an election, but then there's also a need to make sure that we're hearing all voices. The best way for us to do that is I think, similar to how we developed our equity policy, which is going to push us in those directions. We have to sit down with students and parents and design the right way to do that. You know, if we decide, we're going to get it wrong. But we need to have the conversations with students and parents to design that system in order to make sure that it meets the needs that we're putting out for it. So I appreciate that. One of the things in the law about student representation to the Board of Ed is that that individual be elected by the student body. So one of the things we can do there is have multiple people involved, multiple students involved in that representation, so that we're honoring the elected, the electoral process among kids, but we're also ensuring that we're hearing voices from other corners as well. We're going to have to have broader participation from students than just one student to be elected and sit at the table. Yeah, well, and one of the things that we found really refreshing about the Student of the Month process, and one of the things I found over the years, where a lot of districts and schools will look at the Student of the Month process as a you're being rewarded and recognized for getting a high grade, or a traditional kind of, important to recognize those things, to be sure, but at the same time, we have so many students come into our Student of the Month process who exhibit, that help each other. That do very, that are recognized by their teachers and counselors and other folks here as helpers, as self-starters. And we can talk about, what are the values that are embodied in the profile of a student at this school, and who exhibits those values in the way that we feel most comfortable with them representing their peers. So lots of important questions there, but we're going to need help designing that from our kids and our parents, definitely. Was there a Bruce? And then okay. Let's head back up to the tables, because I'm being told that your questions aren't coming across the microphone real well. So if we go back to the table, we'll pick up with your question, and Ms. Kellogg, you have a question as well, right? Yeah, thanks. All right, so let's move back to the table just so the microphones can pick up your questions a little bit better. Thank you, Ms. Tucker. All right, and we're done with the screen for now. Go ahead, start over. The floor is yours.
I just wanted to make a note about the comment regarding the difficulties in administering cell phone possession rules in the classroom. And I'm only speaking as a substitute teacher, but I've had that problem recently, maybe 8th grade, not 9th grade, because I'm not substituting here. I'm substituting in Flemington, JPKs. The problem exists that I think one of the key things, along with what you've discussed, is having the rules understood by the students before you hit the classroom. In other words, yeah, it's part of this code of conduct and all that kind of thing, but I think it also has to be stated. I don't know if it's in assembly, along with a lot of other things in the assembly. This is the rule.
Yeah.
Theoretically, in Flemington, I can take their cell phone from them, give it back after class. It's not a permanent take, I say, okay, you're looking, you say, I've been warned once, twice, give me your phone. And they will do that. They usually don't want to do that, so it's something they don't like, so they try not to let me see they're on the cell phone. But the fact that the thing I'm saying is that they do it. They don't resist that, and that's because it's a rule there.
Yep.
And the rule is strict. You're not supposed to be on your phone at all. So if you violate that, we can take your phone. Now, I think the problem that you've identified that they haven't identified is when they leave to go to the bathroom, oh, I've got to have a drink of water, can I go down? That kind of thing. Then things come apart. There's no question about that. And in those cases, we need to have pre-formulated, understood, agreed to regulations, and then in the classroom it's much easier, because this teacher doesn't have to be the one to teach them that regulation. Do you know that? They don't have to say, hey, you've heard it, you've seen it, It's been there, the signs are on the wall, you know, that kind of thing.
You know,
That's all.
absolutely. And you know, in our policy currently, there are places where we can definitely identify stricter rules. And again, I use that word, but it is what that's what they are. The best example that I have of that is that kind of scenario that you're talking about. Between the bells of a classroom session, unless a teacher has said,
Right.
please take out your phone, or you can take out your phone to do X, Y, and Z, there should be no phones out.
Right.
And one of the key things that we're going to have to do is model that, which means that adults have to show that. You know, so it's very difficult for a student, understandably, if they can't do that because we're valuing face-to-face interaction and all of those things, and this is why we have this rule. But there are adults sort of doing
I
the
think
exact
you're
wrong
absolutely
thing, right? You know, so it can't be because it's the rule. It also has to be because it leads to interactions that we want to promote. And that means all of us. That means me. You know, that means all of us have to jump in and abide by that norm. So moving a
Kinda
rule into a
embarrassing
norm.
when you're in the middle of a classroom and you've told them they can't use their cell phone, and you may even have disciplined one, and you get a call on your cell phone.
Yes.
And a teacher that takes that call in the middle of that environment destroys all the possibility of disciplining the students for the same thing. It becomes so the teachers have to understand that they also have to be disciplined in that way during class themselves.
Yeah, and if I could just add on to that, one of the things Dr. Moore and I have talked about, I know Mr. Brandt has suggested, is getting back to your point about students knowing the rule, is we need to send a clear communication out
Right.
to students and families as to what our cell phone policy is.
Right.
Because I think a lot of folks don't know that it exists and what it says. So,
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially reiterating it now is going to require that. And it's again, it's as much about sort of rules and all of that. But I mean, really, what it is about for us is we have this. We're fortunate. We're blessed to have this moment of being together, and there may have been some bad habits picked up around some of this stuff when we weren't together. But now we're together, and so we've got to be really deliberate about how we're spending that time together. And that's kind of the spirit behind it, but the rules can start quite simply as between the bells of a classroom session, unless somebody gives you permission, there's no phone out. You go to the bathroom, there's no phone in the hallway. There's no phone certainly in the bathroom. You know, and how we get to all of those things and enforce all of those things are all of the conversations that we're having now.
Right. Thank you.
Ms. Kellogg?
With the Class 3 officer, I'm supportive of having another Class 3 officer, but I'm not sure that that's going to be a silver bullet for all of the problems that have been identified by the students and the safety concerns. So I would like to continue that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. The Class 3 officer fits into a very specific need around, you know, how law enforcement is working with students in our community, and what that looks like for them to continue to support us as a school and the kinds of things that they support us in. They found themselves just having to deal with a lot more contact over the past couple of years than ever before, and need some more feet on the ground to help do that. I agree that safety and other kinds of concerns beyond that need to be addressed. And so we talk about, you know, conversations about lunch and what does it look like to move back to a more normal lunch versus not. I mean, these are the things that we're planning out and talking about right now based on some of these survey results. What could it look like to include more student input on our district safety team? You know, because currently that's less than it might be. And as we involve more students in government governance and policy discussions, that's an area where we can bring them in, definitely. It's definitely gratifying that a large number of 84% I think was the number. I can't remember. It was upwards of 80-something% of students reported that they felt comfortable and safe in all locations on campus. But I'm not satisfied with that, and there's more to do, certainly. So I appreciate that. And then a lot of that conversation could end up being O&T conversation. Some additional things we're looking at, the technology around vape sensors has really increased and improved. That's something that we're looking at in the near future as well for our restrooms. And some additional capabilities in monitoring student activity on their Chromebooks and on our network too are things that we've been looking at. So there are a couple other things in the works as well, but just not ready to report details to you on. Thank you.
Jeff, if I could just add, something else that might be helpful would be some, just some education or information sessions for students around social media and behavior, because there are a lot of laws changing right now about digital defamation and a lot of cases now about what happens when you defame or harass someone on social media. So it just came up that might be useful too.
Yeah, thank you. And we have done some good, we do different orientations and assemblies with kids in large format, and that's helpful. The prosecutor's office comes out each year and talks to students about all of the implications of social media abuse from a legal point of view. We see an opportunity to equip more teachers, health and PE teachers, family consumer science teachers, to have those smaller scale conversations in classes also. So not just discrete programming, which we need to do more of, and for parents as well, but embedding those conversations in a consistent way in our classes too, so that different teachers are talking about some of the same ideas and some of the same themes with kids around all of this. So there are curricular implications here too. So absolutely, we're finding the need to broaden that conversation into all different kinds of corners. All right.
Dr. Moore, first wanted to thank you for the report. Great information, great insight. I always get a little nervous when I see statistics, especially when they're summarized, rolled up. It can be shown in many different lights, depending on the light you want to put on it. I would be interested first in knowing, was there a collaboration and is there insight of how our numbers are benchmarked against other schools in the region or in the state? So does the variation look the same? Did we even have a survey that was similar enough to other schools that you could get that benchmarking? Because that also tells when you normalize things against the greater population. And is there an opportunity for us to see some sort of visualization of the aggregation of data, perhaps with the slices that you want us to focus on, so we can see, are things lumped, are things heavy, are things very, heat mapped kind of a perspective?
Yeah.
So that's on the statistics, but again, still great analysis because it gives us good insight.
Thank you.
Some thoughts, cell phones, that's a tough nut to crack. I've never found it to be a trouble if framed correctly and expectations set to include more people, including our students, in those conversations of what is a realistic expectation and resolution that they would be amenable to as well. I mean, I still feel it's a healthy conversation, even though it can go left real fast. And finally, on the students being more engaged with the board and other larger activities, not to shovel work at another organization I'm not part of, but could Student Life and Program Committee take on something like figuring out how do we frame that, engaging more with the student population, the parents, and bring us along that path a little faster?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple of different areas to quickly respond to there, but the mandate requires us from the state to have student representation to the board. We can fulfill that mandate with the flick of a switch by what we've already been doing. So we are already very close to compliance with the mandate as of September 1, but we do imagine something much more robust than that. I've often said that compliance should be the byproduct of better stuff that we do. And I think Student Life and Program is a fine place to begin drafting the board's interface with kids, or one place to begin drafting the board's interface with kids in a broader, deeper way. Other piece in there, in terms of the survey data, as we flesh out more specific questions from the board, I'm happy to share. Yeah, so we'll get some specific questions that you'd like us to follow up on, and then we can take deeper dives here in committee in other ways. I want to make sure that you're feeling satisfied in all that you're seeing. I don't have a good answer to your other question, which is no, there is no way for us to benchmark against other schools. Particularly this survey where we revised the survey to do some very specific things that were important to the community of kids and parents and everybody who was designing it. So we asked some very specific questions that were scratching some itches that were really specific to our conversations. There are survey engines out there. There are various survey providers that can offer that sort of functionality to us, who do climate and culture surveys across schools and then can give you a deeper insight into how you're stacking up against other schools. Right now, we'd have to kind of sit down school by school, district by district, and just compare results and see where we saw some overlap. But we could certainly explore one of those packages that would put us in a larger pool of responses. And that could be really valuable. We've talked a lot with our IT department about how we can do better data dashboarding, and that would be an important part of that. So definitely a target for us.
And if I could just respond back to the student rep question, that is something that's on our board retreat agenda to discuss.
Also, Mr. Fowler, if you navigate to the Student Life and Program Committee on board docs, under discussion items, 2.2, Climate and Culture Survey, there is an attachment there that has a more fine-grained look at the data.
Yeah, I'll send that to all of you too, just to ease, because you can go in and grab it from the Student Life, but there's a PDF that gives all the pie graphs. But I imagine we'll want to have some deeper conversations about other ways to visualize the data to get some additional insight. And we have more work to do too, where we've analyzed them as the data as directionals. There are some statistical things that we need to do next to understand variance and some of the other qualities of what we saw in the survey results.
And Dr. Moore, will your presentation be posted on the website?
Yes. So I have a PDF of this presentation. We'll also see how the recording comes out. We might be able to separate that out and present it separately. And if it's not good for that, we'll do something separate and just
I think it would be helpful to have it
yeah.
available to parents who couldn't be present either in person or on Zoom tonight.
And we are planning as we continue, like a lot of the policies that we're dealing with now, the counseling policy, the equity policy, as we talk about those, they require this kind of regular measurement that we're going to have to present in a much more concise and a much more nimbler way. So we imagine area of our website devoted to this as well, so that it's all available in there, not just climate and culture, but all sorts of measurements. All right, thank you all. Thank you for your attention and your patience through all of that as well. Thank you, Mr. Brandt, for your help and your good work on all the survey design and administration there over the course of the year. So there is just one motion here on a HIB for you to consider, and then that will mark the conclusion of my report. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Can I have a motion, please, to affirm the administrator's disposition for HIB 2122-053?
So moved.
In tandem. Is there any discussion? Can I have a roll call vote, please?
Mrs. Blatfield?
Abstain.
Dr. Charney?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson? Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg?
Yes.
Mr. Nichol?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mr. Richard?
Yes.
And Mrs. Hughes?
Yes.
Oh, yes, motion carries.
Thank you, Mrs. Spitzer. We will move on to our first residence forum. If there's anyone here who has any comments on any items on the agenda for action tonight? Oh, okay. Nope, okay, hearing none. Oh, all right, Mr. Smoker, come on up. You have 5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes? I'm not going to take 5 minutes.
Please state your name and municipality.
Am I supposed to turn it back? How's that? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, let me put my name down here. I am Matt Smoker, co-president of HCEA. I was also chief negotiator for the negotiations, and I've been a math teacher here for almost 20 years. I'd like to thank the board and the negotiations team for their support in the negotiations process. I was a member of the team the last round, and this one felt much more collaborative than the last. Many of our proposals were trying to address similar goals. We're aiming to solve some common problems of retention of good staff and the ability to hire quality candidates. Our goals were aligned to continue the quality educational experience for our students. While we didn't agree on everything and we weren't able to address every concern of the staff, I feel that we did a good job working together to recognize the restraints of the budget and the taxpayers and recognizing the most of the needs of our staff, and therefore trying to keep us competitive among other schools and ultimately giving us the best experience for our students. This is a difficult time for educators and education. We're coming out of an unprecedented pandemic, and political views putting more pressure on educators than ever before. A 5-year contract will give a much-needed stability to make sure that we're able to do the best for our students. Thank you for that. I look forward to working with the administration and the board for at least the next year as co-president. Thank you for all you do for our students in the community, and I hope you're working under the same motto as I am. Do the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
Thank you, Mr. Smoker.
Thank you.
And on behalf of the board, the negotiating team, I can say the feelings are mutual. We thank you for all of your hard work and the team's hard work, and we are very grateful to have reached a settlement for 5 years with the staff.
Thank you.
Anyone else, items on the agenda for action? Okay, with that, we do not have organizational items, correct? That's just a title? Okay. Then we'll move right into committee reports. Mr. Richard, do you have an update for us on Student Life and Program, please?
I do. Student Life Committee meeting occurred this past Thursday, and there are 8 items for approval tonight. Item number 1, Ms. Cangelosi-Hayes shared the district's PD plan for 22-23. This plan is required to be submitted annually. There is a continued focus on addressing learning gaps in data-driven instruction, diversity, equity, inclusion, social and emotional learning, and instructional technology. The district is in the process of planning, the 22-23 school year PD program, including professional educators workshop in August. Item number 2, the committee reviewed the nursing services plan for this coming school year. This is also required on an annual basis, and Dr. Webb noted that there were no major changes to the plan. Item number 3, the committee reviewed the proposal for an overnight trip for the Marching Red Devils for the Imagination Campus Youth Education Series in Orlando, Florida. The trip is scheduled for April 10 to 12 in 2023, and the trip will be funded by students as well as through fundraising efforts. Item number 4, Ms. Cangelosi-Hayes reviewed the 2 policies that are recorded here. Policy 5320, immunization, has been revised to include language that is aligned with the New Jersey Administrative Code. Updates are minimal. Policy 0143.2 involves high school student representation on the Board of Ed, which we talked about earlier. The student will be a non-voting board member and act as a liaison. Item number 5, this is the second read for Policy 2411 on counseling services. The language has been broadened to be more inclusive to address more student demographic subgroups and identities. In item number 6, Ms. Cangelosi-Hayes provided brief information about the tuition and transportation agreements for several of these special ed students. All these contracts are continued placements for these students. Item number 7, Ms. Cangelosi-Hayes reviewed information about the district's corporate sponsor program. The corporate sponsorship program provides valuable advertising exposure to target customers at the high school's athletic events and competitions. It also provides the district with the revenue needed to supply continued athletic and extracurricular programs for our students while reducing costs to local taxpayers. The program includes 6 levels of membership with varying degrees of exposure, including signage, announcements, and season passes. for the businesses. This past year, the program generated over $34,000 in revenue for supplemental purchases. And finally, item number 8, Mr. Brand reviewed the benefits and opportunities the district receives from its membership to the New Jersey State Interscholastic Athletic Association. And we have to renew this every year to stay members in that organization. And that's it for items that are being moved on tonight. So hereby I'd like to move items 1 through 8.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion?
Just a quick thank you to, let's see, it was Ms. Kellogg, it was Mrs. Hughes. Who else was in on the counseling policy? Just the two of us? Yeah. Two of you, rather? Yeah. Lots of good conversations and work there, and I think in line with our findings on the Climate and Culture Survey as well, that's pointing us in the right direction in a good way. So I appreciate and am thankful for all the work that everybody did on that policy.
As well as the staff committee.
Yes.
If there's no discussion, could I have a roll call, please?
Mrs. Blackfield?
Yes.
Dr. Charney?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson? Yes. Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg?
Yes.
Mr. Nichol?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mr. Richard?
Yes.
And Mrs. Hughes?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
Thank you, Mrs. Spitzer. Mr. Nichol, Operations and Transportation update, please.
Yes, Operations and Transportation met on Tuesday last week, the 12th. We discussed current and recent construction projects happening here at the school. There are several items on tonight's agenda I'd like to highlight. We have looking to approve joint transportation agreement with Delaware Valley Regional High School for the 22-23 extended school year at the money shown. Also, a joint transportation agreement with Del Val again for the 22-23 school year, as shown in the agenda dollar-wise. And as Dr. Moore discussed earlier, we need to approve an agreement with Raritan Township for the next 3 years, not just for the 2 Class 3 officers, but for a third. We are looking to accept a donation of almost $23,800 from the self-insured Student IT Device Insurance Fund, which we are going to use to purchase new Chromebook devices. Approve Dr. Moore's recommendation to basically waive our activity participation fees, which we're doing again. This is what, the 3rd year I think we're doing this. Donation of 10 used Chromebooks to Safe Harbor. We have some extraordinary aid from the state of New Jersey for $937,991 for special education student excess costs. Approve as needed an increase in the 22-23 budget for the same dollar amount pursuant to state laws and regulations. And also to accept non-public transportation aid from the state of New Jersey for $33,060 for excess non-public school transportation costs. With that, I'd like to move items H1 through H14.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, can I have a roll call vote, please?
Mrs. Blackfield?
Yes.
Dr. Charney?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson? Yes. Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg? Yes. Mr. Nichol?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mr. Richard?
Yes.
And Mrs. Hughes?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
Thank you. Mr. Davidson, Personnel Committee, please.
Yes, this evening we have a long list of items. I will try and summarize them. I will not go through a lot of detail. Starting through in it's the usual way. We'll get to the bulk of it in a minute. We have a resignation. And contrary to custom, I'm just going to mention that we have some appointments, a rescinded appointment, and then the most important of all, the HCEA contract. And beyond there, from item 5 through item 18, I believe. Yes, item 18 are the reauthorizations and reappointments of all the teachers and staff for the high school. This occurs every year, and it's routine. But every year, at the beginning of, at the end of the year, beginning of the next year, we must go and reauthorize and reappoint all of these people in all of these categories. So I'll read the category, but just go get down them very quickly. If you wish to see the detail, you have a number of pages in your agenda that you may refer to. So reading down from the HCE contract, item 4, we are now reappointing the teachers who are tenured, athletic trainers, strength coach, HCEA teacher non-tenured, and you can see the effective dates. HCEA teachers acquiring tenure, secretaries that are tenured, secretaries that are non-tenured, paraprofessionals, technical staff, the mechanics, the custodians, the maintenance staff, and including operational stipends. We end that particular section with the salary guides advancements under the HCEA contract. Any comments from any of the staff, or just, I think I'll move on, okay.
Just one comment. I just want to say that we're
We then
extremely...
go to hourly appointments.
I'll say it later.
What? Okay.
One second.
Okay. Hourly appointments follow, with then home instructors for the year. ESY teachers, paraprofessionals, speech therapists, and behaviorists, and then a group of items for summer work, which we've seen before, which are summer curriculum, special services for the summer, special services for the summer IEP, well, the previous was nurse work. And then we have special services, summer work general. We have summer academy, ELL instructors, summer institute instructors, summer Aspire credit completion instructors, summer bridge program instructors, special services, summer child study team. So that takes us through item 30. And then during the summer, we also do ELL intake testing. And then we have Schedule C advisor. We're appointing SAT course instructors for the year. We're doing the Nurtured Heart approach training, very valuable there for the staff. Schedule D coaches, internships, students teaching observers in the unified sports stipends, new teacher, mentor trainer, and revisions, one item. That's the list of 40 items to be moved. I believe they're all to be moved?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So if that's, I will ask for, I will move items 1 through 40 on the personnel agenda.
Second. I have a motion and a second. I'm going to make a brief comment, and then I'll open it up to the rest of the board members. I just want to say that this is a happy agenda, mostly because of the contract that's been settled, but also the reappointment of all our staff, for whom we are extremely grateful. I won't go through the list, but Mr. Davidson did a really good job of hitting all of our categories, because I'm afraid of missing somebody, but certainly teachers, secretaries, athletic trainers. I'm doing what I said I wasn't going to do. Strength coach, technical staff, mechanics, custodial staff, everyone, our paras, our supervisors, our directors, our principal, Mr. Brandt, our superintendent, Dr. Moore, who are not on this agenda, but I just want to take a moment and just express appreciation for all of our staff, because Central wouldn't be the school it is without our staff. So it's a happy, positive agenda, particularly from the personnel standpoint tonight. So thank you, everyone. Does anyone else have any comments?
I have questions.
Yeah, sure, Dr. Torney.
Is it appropriate to ask questions about the contract in this forum?
I think that should be an executive session,
Cool.
since it's negotiations. Anyone else? Oh.
I moved items 1 through 40.
Yes.
Yeah,
So it
was
has
it-
been moved and seconded.
Right. Was it
Yeah.
something that is going to affect your vote on the contract, or is it just a question that you want a clarification for?
I'd say clarity, but clarity would or should indicate some modification, I would think.
So go ahead and ask, and
Okay,
then...
so my question is, we do reimburse for education credits as long as the staff member achieves a passing grade. What's a passing grade?
So the contract defines a passing grade as anything that bears credit for the staff member. And so that's a negotiated point, but the language of the contract accepts anything that results in credit as reimbursable.
So the district does not have a standard by which, for example, a B or better achieved in a course in order to get reimbursed.
So no, in our contracts, the language that's been negotiated is that any course performance that results in credit is considered passing, and so we don't have other lines there. I would have to check the HCAA contract, but I'm not sure that we have that there either.
And I don't think that language has changed, right?
No, that hasn't changed. That's the traditional language.
That was in
yes.
our
That was the
previous
existing contract.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
My second question is about what I think might be new is a market rate for recruitment of certain teachers. And I agree with that, because the bare ground realities is that some subject areas are much harder to recruit teachers than others. Do we define those subject areas?
So the way the contract reads moving forward is that where there have in the past been limits on step placement for teachers coming into the district, where we could only approve teachers to be up to a certain step, those limits are now gone. So the contract doesn't specify particular subjects, but instead there's flexibility in hiring staff of any subject.
Is the intention to look at other categories of work, such as the private sector, or working with children in other venues, or are you empowered, I guess, ultimately, Superintendent, to just raise the step placement because of the implicit value of the position?
So the language of the contract empowers me to recommend to you a placement on any step based on my read of the candidate's experience and their value. My commitment to the folks who are here and who've been here a long time is to be ready to discuss the rationale for that if there are ever any questions about any particular step placement for a new employee. But yeah, I mean, the contract allows now the flexibility for me to recommend placement on a step based on my read of their experience, whether it's public school, private school, industry, et cetera.
I guess my concern is that if the union questions the position, the placement of a person on the guide, is there going to be conflict on the fairness and appropriateness of that placement, whereas perhaps another position was not put at that step because it's not as competitive? That's my concern.
Yeah, I mean, I have to fall back to something that I'm very grateful for, which is the openness that we have in our conversations between myself and the association, and the accountability that I have to the staff and to you to make reasonable recommendations. So the contract doesn't cover all those things specifically, but in the implementation of it, I know we'll have frequent conversations about it, as we do about most things in the contract. So
you're empowered to make that decision?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but I feel a commitment to be able to rationalize it as well. And that's the duty that I have both to you and to the staff, to make sure that that everything's fair.
All right. Anything else? Anyone have any other questions or comments on personnel? Okay, so I think we have a motion and a second on I-1 through 40. Can I have a roll call vote, please?
Mrs. Butterfield?
Yes.
Dr. Charney?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg?
Yes.
Mr. Nichol?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mr. Richard?
Yes.
Mrs. Hughes?
Yes.
Oh, yes, motion carries.
Thank you. And Mrs. O'Donnell, can we have an update from Racism, Equity, and Diversity Committee, please?
Yes, the committee met last Thursday. We had Mr. Cohen joined us from the Extended Policy Committee. We came out of that meeting with, I believe, 3 very small minor edits to the policy, which included at the first bullet point where the policy says grow capacity. We added the words grow our organizational to capacity. We also, at the end of those 3 bullet points, the word seen was added, where it says students will belong for who they are. We added seen and belong for who they are. And then lastly, we've got punctuation around each and all, where we say each means every and all means all, which we liked a lot because that's language that goes along with the mission statement as well. So that's second read tonight for that policy. And I would like to move that policy tonight for a vote.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion about the policy?
You know, as with the counseling policy, this was a very comprehensive project, involved a lot of research, a lot of cooperation from folks in the community, as well as our students and staff and board members here. We've had multiple conversations here at the table about it, and it's a good document. This is a good policy. We should be proud of it. And the thing that I'm most thankful for is all of these things that we're talking about, whether it's climate and culture, or it's rules and regs, or it's discipline, all of these things that we're talking about are impacted by the lofty goals of this policy. So I'm pleased to get to work.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Any other comments? Can I have a roll call vote, please?
Mrs. Butterfield?
Yes.
Dr. Charney?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg?
Yes.
Mr. Nichol?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mr. Richard?
Yes.
And Mrs. Hughes?
Yes.
Oh, yes, motion carries.
Thank you, Mrs. Spitzer. We will move on now to additional business. I just have one item of additional board business. I spoke with our board retreat facilitator, Judy Wilson, today. Also spoke with Ms. Kellogg, who is our chair of our retreat committee. Mrs. Wilson suggested that we meet from 5 to 8:30 on August 29th and August 30th, trying to be respectful of folks' work schedules, but not start too late that we're all sort of yawning into the night. Her suggestion was that we start the meeting at 5 o'clock with a light dinner that Dr. Moore said would be okay if we offered that to the board, with the actual meeting starting around 5:30 to 8:30, so that 5 to 5:30 will let folks sort of come in and get out of work and get there in time. So I'd like to propose, if nobody has any objections, to running our meeting starting at 5 o'clock on August 29th and 30th, our board retreat, with the actual meeting starting closer to 5:30 and ending at 8:30. Anybody have any thoughts, comments?
The only thing I'll add is the location needs to be determined. We do have some things going on in the evening in the building on particularly the 29th. We have parent orientation for 9th graders, but we'll find a good location for us to host the meeting and get some good deliberative work done together. This isn't the right format for that kind of meeting, but we do need to make room for anybody who wants to join us. So.
Second item on board retreat. Ms. Kellogg or I will be sending out an email to the committee probably tomorrow. That's Mr. Davidson and Dr. Charney, correct? I think those are the only 2 folks on the committee, and Dr. Moore, obviously, proposing a meeting so that we can get back to looking at the agenda now that we have our dates and times set. We're going to need to get back to the agenda and sort of synthesize the ideas that we had. We talked about it for a little bit, but now we need to really get down to brass tacks so that we have a document in place to share with Mrs. Wilson. We'd like to do that this week, so I'm just going to put everybody on notice because there's some scheduling conflicts next week and the week after, so just look out for that email probably tomorrow morning to see if we could squeeze out an hour by Zoom this week to talk about the retreat agenda. And that's it for me. Anybody else have any additional board business? Dr. Moore?
No, thank you.
So at this time, we will move into our second residence forum. This is for comment on any item, not necessarily on the agenda. If you'd like to speak, come to the mic, state your name and municipality for the record. You'll have 5 minutes to speak for a total of 30 minutes. You'll be notified at 4 minutes when you have 1 minute remaining. Sure.
Lisa Santangelo, Reddington Township. So regarding policy 5520 in regards to the May 16th demonstration, last week I asked via email to Mrs. Hughes and Dr. Moore my question, since there is no carve-out for sanctioned demonstrations in the policy, does the board attorney agree that sanctioned demonstrations are in violation of policy 5520? Dr. Moore's response back was a sanctioned event in which staff and students work together to ensure that there is no material disruptions would not trigger violations under the policy. I disagree with Dr. Moore's assessment. If the board wishes to modify the policy, then it can do so. But as currently written, there is no carve-out for sanctioned demonstrations. The policy states that it prohibits demonstrations that interfere with the orderly operation of the educational program or offends the rights of others. Every sanctioned demonstration will offend the rights of others. There are always two or more sides to any issue. Someone's rights will be offended. Having a sanctioned demonstration where hundreds of students amass is always a disruption. We saw this happen on May 16th. Demonstrators are missing class while others are in class. Is it okay for some students to miss class to attend gatherings? Although the school has stated it was unsanctioned, in the May 17th incident report and at the May 23rd Board of Education presentation, it was stated it was unsanctioned. So the May 16th demonstration was clearly in violation of the policy. Based on emails and actions from the Open Public Records Act, which is the OPRA request, the May 16th demonstration was very likely sanctioned in all but name only. Noted by Dr. Moore on May 23rd, the school stopped the anti-mask protest. In an email by Mr. Brandt on February 9th, he confirms that he was aware of the anti-masking demonstration when it was planned and the location. This demonstration was stopped by both Dr. Moore and Mr. Brandt. For the May 16th presentation, Dr. Moore and Mr. Brandt were also aware ahead of time and allowed it to proceed. By not stopping it, their actions made it a sanctioned demonstration. Why stop the anti-mask but not the Roe versus Wade demonstration? In an email from redacted sender to Mr. Brandt on Saturday, May 14th, want to let you know on Monday, starting during passing time after 3rd block outside of Stewart Field, there will be a demonstration. Mr. Brandt's reply was not, no, this is not allowed. Knowing the time and location, Mr. Brandt can easily have stopped it. Instead, he writes back, realize it's not a school-sponsored event. However, we will do our best to secure your safety. This is a tacit approval of the demonstration. The morning of the 16th, teacher Karen Malzoni sent an email to Mr. Brandt warning of a protest she overheard her students discussing. Once again, Mr. Brandt allowed it to occur, and there are other emails as well, including the social media invite. By not stopping the May 16th demonstration with receiving advance notice, it was a tacit approval to move forward. Mr. Brandt even mentions providing security. This is turning into a sanctioned demonstration by the actions of Dr. Moore and Mr. Brandt. Another disturbing email is from Vice Principal Hall on May 17th. Quote, kudos to the students on both sides for getting out there and expressing themselves, exclamation. This was probably the most valuable thing they did all year, unquote. Let me remind you that a girl was physically assaulted that day. Another email for Dr. Moore to staff on May 17th also voices his support for the demonstration. In part, it reads, quote, abortion rights brought our students together. Again, a girl was physically assaulted. This makes me believe, one, a protest that Dr. Moore disagrees with, anti-masking, can be stopped. Two, a protest that Dr. Moore agrees with, pro-choice, which will be allowed to go through. Three, both are not sanctioned. Four, both were given advance notice to the school prior to occurring. One was stopped and one was given tacit approval. Keep in mind, at no point we know parents were not notified prior. Interestingly, only 35.7% of students from the recent climate survey results are very clear on what Central's rules and consequences for behavior are. How can we ask our students to follow the rules or hold them accountable when the leadership of this school is not held to the same standards? You lose tremendous credibility with the students when you do things like this. That's why it is so important for the board to hold the administration accountable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is David Rizza. I'm from Reddington Township. I wasn't prepared to speak, so after seeing the presentation was on the culture survey, took some notes. I want to talk about that. One, I want to thank you for actually doing a presentation. It actually makes it much easier for my audience when there's actually something to see on the screen. It's the second time you've done that, so that's actually makes it very beneficial for the audience. But there's a couple things I noticed, and there's two things that came up from the board. One from Ms. Kellogg, her question, and same thing with Mr. Fowler, that I actually wrote down. I was hoping to get an answer on, and I really wasn't overly satisfied with Dr. Moore's answer. So first I'm going to start with Mr. Fowler's. He brought about the statistics and how you could do averages and so on, and could kind of, I wouldn't say, you can make the data not be what it truly is, and it'd be great to have the underlying. I raised the same thing about 2 board meetings ago on Policy 8100, how the equity presentation on the website basically did the same thing. It's percentages, no numbers, almost a useless report. So now I go to another presentation that Dr. Moore did, and he did the same thing. So it was kind of almost meaningless what he presented. And the reason why I bring that is while he was doing that, ironically, I was scrolling through my cell phone because you guys talked about cell phones a lot, and I actually had the PDF from the student surveys with the PowerPoints. So since that wasn't presented, I think it's kind of important because that's actually what should have been presented, not made up numbers by Dr. Moore. So the first thing I want to bring up is that he stated 80-something% were safe in school. If you actually looked at the presentation, which you requested, which I hope you do look at, it was actually 61.7. Much, much different. And then when you look at other things, and the reason why it's another thing about that is about a couple board meetings ago, my son, who graduated in 2021, spoke. He mentioned when he went to school, 24% on the cultural survey didn't feel safe in bathrooms. This one, 24%. Once again, if you read the actual report, don't feel safe in bathrooms. He goes, I bet you next year it's going to be 24%. And in next year, who knows, right? Ms. Kellogg asked that question, how is a safety officer going to impact that? They won't. I was thinking the same exact thing. So Dr. Moore kind of answers it, but he doesn't really he skirts around the question. How will you prevent it from being 24% next year? Some of the examples, if you talk to students, this is the smoker's bathroom. That's where they have sex bathroom. That's the drug bathroom. The students know, the teachers know, that's why you get 24%. So it's something you guys can fix, and the safety officer is not going to do that. But I want to bring up a couple other things because it goes to metrics and how you present surveys. There's 5 ratings on it. Almost never, once in a while, sometimes, frequently, and almost always. Everyone, every company, everyone always says frequently and almost always are positive. The others are negative that you have to look at. Always look at that. He didn't do that. He kind of averaged this and heat charts and whatever, but it really should be frequently and almost always. So look at some of the numbers. Teachers make learning interesting, 25%. Teachers recognize us, 25%. Enjoy being at school, 23%. Students can work out disapprovals, 18%. I matter at Central, 25%. Students' activities and clubs, 40% do they participate. Comfortable expressing yourself, 30%. Students that decide what's going on, 20%. You didn't get this from Dr. Moore's presentation. That's what should have been presented. Mr. Fowler, you're absolutely 100% right. Ms. Kellogg, your question you answered, absolutely perfect. Those are what should have been presented. And the other thing that noticed is he said the bathroom was mainly 10th graders. It was 24%. That would mean every 10th grader has an issue with bathroom, but everyone else is okay. Obviously, it's not just 10th graders. You can't get 24%. Divided by 600, was that 800? No, 750 or whatever. A lot of students, right? I'm not going to do the math. So based on that, it's not just 10th graders. Present the actual data. You didn't do it on Policy 8100, you guys just approved it. You got this report, you're just going to, okay. The questions that the board asks are extremely important. You guys should hold the administration accountable, and I hope you do. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak tonight? Okay, with that, we'll close our second public session, move on to board comments. Just one comment that I want to make. I just want to reiterate something very important that Mr. Richard said that just relates to the comment that was just made. The board was provided that data in board documents. So all of that data that was just indicated was provided not only to the Student Life Committee that discussed it in their meeting last week, but it was also posted in board docs available to all board members. Does anyone else have any board comments?
I just have one. Mrs. Santangelo mentioned an email from a Vice Principal Hall. We don't have a Vice Principal Hall. I believe the email she's referring to came from a community member. I just wanted to make sure the record showed that. Okay. Again, the email that you're referring to did not come from an employee. It came from a community member.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Any other comments? Okay. With that, we are fortunate enough to have our board council here tonight to do our annual board ethics training. And then once concluded, we'll move into executive session.
So we should.
Moore might need some help getting
Yeah,
this
I
on.
understand. We should
Yes,
move
okay.
down to
Sure.
the seats. Can we have the screen down, please? What kind of computer is that? You're in good shape.
Look at that. Good to see you, Jeff.
Jeff, did you power projector up? Where's the? Okay, thanks. Oop. All right. As we get set up, if you want to move down to.
Thank you. Good, how are you? It's nice. I forgot how cold this one is. All right. Fantastic.
And you have no sound, right?
No, I barely have slides, you know. All right. Okay, well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to see everyone. It's been a long time. Thank you all for bearing with me. I appreciate the categorization of this as being fortunate to have an ethics presentation here at 7:30, 7:45, 8 o'clock on a Monday night in the middle of July when it's a breezy, 95 degrees outside. So let me thank you in advance for your kind attention. As you know, your ethics training is something that you're required to do annually. I'm not going to pretend that this is the most exciting presentation that I get to give, but it is one that you have to do, so we're going to do our best. And so to that point, the law does require you to discuss it annually, to adopt policies and procedures regarding training of District Board of Education members and providing documentation that each member has received the Code of Ethics and reviewed it. So in terms of our School Ethics 101, you are the governing body of the school district charged with high-level policy-making decisions. You are the only entity that can enter into contracts or other binding agreements. This is a real school lawyer pet peeve when I get contracts that say the Hunterdon Central Regional School District enters into a contract with someone else. The school district is the territorial boundaries. The Board of Education is the legal entity. Just a fun little fact for everyone, getting us warmed up tonight with the good stuff. So your decision-making authority is limited. You can't administer the schools, and you can't act in many situations without the chief school administrator's recommendation.
So when we talk about school ethics, right? So like I said, this isn't the sexiest topic, okay? But I think it's really important because being a Board of Education member, particularly in New Jersey, is a very specific role. And I think ethics are something that we all assume are sort of inherent, something that we should all know. There's some sort of commonality, and that is not necessarily the truth in this context. So a code of ethics, as you see up on the slide, it's not the floor. It's not your laws. It's not your policies. It's not your, anything that's any sort of mandate that's imposed on the district. It is also not the ceiling. It doesn't represent your personal morality or your personal beliefs. A code of ethics ideally should help you navigate everything in between the floor and that ceiling. It's supposed to help you navigate the gray area. And I think specific to this universe that you guys are in, being a school board member in New Jersey is very specific. It's not intuitive, the limitations of your roles and what you are and are not empowered to do. So, in terms of our big picture takeaways from tonight, I don't want you to feel like you have to memorize the code of ethics or necessarily retain everything that I share tonight. What I'd like you to walk away feeling is empowered to know when to ask questions, because that's what the Code of Ethics is here for. It's here to empower you. It's not an indictment of anyone or anyone's behavior. There are a lot of sections of this code that you'll see with all good intentions you can trip over. Some of it is just not intuitive. So my hope is that you can walk away with just sort of enough recollection that the bell goes off when you need to get more information. And that's really what a code of ethics should be. And I always make the point, because I think it's fascinating, that every other regulated profession, doctors, lawyers, journalists, all have codes of ethics. They're professional ethics that the profession as a group has agreed on, usually by their sort of governing body, the Bar Association, the American Medical Association. And it's not a dirty word. It's not a taboo in our profession. If we're not sure of something, we talk about the Code of Ethics. We call up the Office of Attorney Ethics. We solicit advice. That doesn't exist in the education profession except at the Board of Education level. So I think in some ways that's a real disservice to educators, because I think it makes some of these things feel, it makes it feel taboo sometimes to ask questions in legitimate gray areas, things that are not necessarily intuitive. Fortunately for the Board of Education, we do have a Code of Ethics to give you guys a jumping off point. So let's get into it. So you'll see the format of my presentation. I'm going to quote the statute. I'm going to quote what the administrative code tells you is evidence of a violation of the statute. And then I'm going to give you a couple case notes. The case notes come from the School Ethics Commission. They're a division within the Department of Education. They're like a quasi-adjudicative body. They review ethics complaints against board members and school administrators, and they make recommendations on penalties when there is a substantiated ethics charge. They also are the ones that are sending you letters, fill out your annual financial disclosure form, make sure you did your annual training, all those sorts of things. So they do two things. So they do render decisions on cases. So when you see me reference case notes that start with a C, that's an actual decision that the School Ethics Commission rendered. Sometimes you'll see a reference and it'll start with an A. It'll have like an A. It'll say like A20-14. Those are called advisory opinions. And one of the most helpful things that I think the School Ethics Commission does is it gives you a process to ask them a question. So I am a board member in this district, my aunt's mother's cousin works, wherever. Is it problematic if I vote on this contract? So it gives you a very clear path to ask questions if you're not sure, which is exactly what we want you to do. Again, none of this is supposed to be intuitive. So when you see something with an A in front of it, that's an advisory opinion that the School Ethics Commission has given in response to a question and that they have decided to make public. So we're going to start with subsection A here. This is an easy one. I will uphold and enforce all laws, rules, and regulations of the State Board of Education and court orders pertaining to schools. Desired changes shall be brought about only through legal and ethical procedures, right? This one feels really straightforward, but if you look back at the last 2 years, even things like following the law are for debate now. Fortunately, in this context, it still means something very serious, very specific. So under the Code of Ethics, evidence of a violation really is a copy of a final decision from any court of law or administrative agency that basically substantiates that a board member or board members failed to enforce laws, rules, and regulations. So there aren't a ton of cases under this particular subsection, and I think the reason is because SEC views this on the back end of a process. So if there is a court order, so if you look at the evidence of the violation, and so my case note here comes from the Pleasantville Board of Education down in Atlantic County, and there were a number of ethics complaints fairly recently filed against board members by their chief school administrator who claimed that the board took action against their employment without issuing a Rice notice, right? Now that's pretty much, public entity, personnel 101. Public employees are entitled to notice that the governing body is going to be discussing their employment and might take action. So this is one that I will tell you surprised a lot of us, that the SEC actually dismissed those complaints without further adjudication, saying that without a copy of a final decision or a court order demonstrating that the board members had violated the law, that the complaint had to be dismissed. And so they were very specific that we're dismissing this based on the information we have in front of us at this moment in time, meaning that there had been no adjudication that law had been violated. So 2-3 years down the road, when a court issues an order, maybe we'll be back revisiting this, but I think it's just interesting to see how narrowly they do construe this. And I will say is, yes, sir.
So, but isn't the burden on the board to issue the Rice? If there's no record of Rice, then I'm surprised the SEC dismissed the complaint.
I was really surprised too. I was, because I think it's something that's a pretty
Procedural, so
there was
guys only get
there was even allegations.
stand on their 2
Yeah.
feet when it's procedural.
There were even allegations that board counsel had made clear to board members that they shouldn't be discussing or taking action because of the absence of this. However, I'll tell you, I was pretty surprised as well. But again, it goes back to what they've decided is evidence of the violation. So, like I said, the decision was very specific that we're making this call based on what's in front of us right now. We do not have a copy of a final decision from any court of law. So I was like, all right, that's pretty narrow, especially when there are some rules that are pretty clear, right? But that is where they landed on it just last month, believe it or not. So yeah, case C5821, there's actually a couple Pleasantville cases that all have the same line of reasoning up there if anyone's interested. Subsection B, I will make decisions in terms of the educational welfare of children and will seek to develop and maintain public schools that meet the individual needs of all children regardless of their ability, race, creed, sex, or social standing. So evidence of a violation in this context is that a board member willfully made a decision contrary to the educational welfare of children or took deliberate action to obstruct the programs and policies designed to meet the individual needs. So what does this look like in practice? Board president raised concerns to the principal and superintendent about their child's teacher and filed an HIB complaint against their child's teacher, did not violate that provision even though that staff member ultimately was not renewed. The comments of the superintendent and the HIB complaint were made in the capacity as a parent, and the decision to non-renew lies solely with the superintendent. So the outcome here, so the complainant in this situation was the non-renewed staff member. They were basically saying, the board sort of acted, guided by something other than educational welfare of children and non-renewing me because this board member had a thing against me. But SEC goes back to the fact that only the superintendent can make recommendations for renewal or non-renewal. And also that board member had complaints in their capacity as a parent. The flip side of this, this was in Livingston, a board member was found to be in violation of this portion of the code when he released an ethics complaint that was filed against another board member to the media. So the complaint was released to the media and it contained information about that other board member's child who happened to be a student. So whatever the motivation was, it was not motivated by educational welfare of that particular child and in fact was against that child's, general interests. Subsection C, you probably heard this a lot over the years. I will confine my board action to policy making, planning, and appraisal. It has a nice ring to it. I say it a lot whenever we're sort of like starting out a tangent about what the board's role is. I'll help to frame policies and plans only after the board has consulted those who will be affected by them. And if I hear one thing at your meetings, it's about all of the sort of input and stakeholders and community that are involved in the various things going on here. So that's always great to see because it takes a lot of effort to do that. Evidence of a violation here is basically just that the board member took action to effectuate policies and plans without consulting those who were affected, or took action that was unrelated to the board member's duty to develop general rules and principles, formulate programs, or ascertain the value or liability of a policy. So this is some interesting cases here. So what we see is C-1614. This is an Asbury Park case. Board members took it upon themselves to conduct a site visit to assess a candidate for the assistant superintendent position without board authority, let alone superintendent authority. That conduct was certainly outside the scope of the board member's authority. You'll see a lot of cases involving personnel. All personnel decisions come through the superintendent. So you'll see a case later on about board members not participating in interviews for anyone below the superintendent, about exit interview committees. So it's one of those things that's very, very specific to the role of a Board of Education member, and it does not involve making personnel recommendations. It just involves taking actions on personnel recommendations that are brought to the board through the superintendent. I think that's one of the least intuitive things about being a board member, and probably one of the bigger misconceptions, I think, publicly in terms of what authority individual board members or even the board as a whole has in terms of hiring and firing and making those decisions absent a recommendation from the superintendent. Yes, ma'am. Well, spoiler alert, subsection H talks about a board member's obligation to consider the superintendent's recommendation as it pertains to personnel. So we actually touch specifically on that later on. But the answer is the board's obligation, the board members and each individual board member's obligation is to merely consider the superintendent's recommendation and to disregard only those that are arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable. Yeah. So for all of these cases that the SEC talks about, the board not really being involved in any recommendations for anyone below the superintendent, I will say that in practice, and our firm represents 60, 70 boards of education, and my old firm represent another 60 or 70, it is highly unusual that there isn't at least a committee structure, especially for higher level administrators. And I think it's pretty common for one or two board members sometimes to be involved, but it all flows through the superintendent. It's driven by the superintendent and the voices that the superintendent is looking to include in that process. So it's one of those things that I think that the way to think about it is the board can't dictate that. The board can't sort of insert itself or demand a voice in some of those decisions. But I think that when the superintendent is creating a process for multiple voices, and even I've seen community members involved, especially like principals and some higher level administrators. And you guys have seen it, right, in your in superintendent searches. You have community forums, you create candidate profiles. There are some sort of kind of more condensed versions of that for high level administrators that board members are sometimes involved in. But again, it comes with the sort of blessing and at the orchestration of the superintendent, which I think is the difference. No one tends to complain about it. Yeah, so the board doesn't necessarily get to sort of impose a process or a procedure for hiring. A lot of times you'll see contractual provisions about posting, posting for 10 days or, like there's some sort of parameters that exist around that come from other places. I think that most, there usually is a process. Every now and then you'll see a situation where there isn't, but especially for administrators, there's usually somewhat of a process. But you are correct. It's not the board's. It's not within the board's policymaking purview to dictate that process. I think it's fair to say that there should be a process. I think it's okay for the board to kind of, have its voice heard in that and say that it's important, right? That we're advertising in different places and that we're posting and that we're trying to get as many candidates as possible and that we are involving stakeholders in the recommendation process. But beyond that, the specifics of it really flow from the superintendent. Mr. Charney.
I just want to make sure, a little nuance. board starts asking questions, can that be construed as an interview?
It's a good question. If the recommendation has already been decided on, if the superintendent has made clear that this is going to be their recommendation and they just want the board to have an opportunity to meet, exactly like you said, meet and greet, I don't necessarily think that would be construed as an interview as long as the superintendent's recommendation is pretty solidified at that point.
What if they vote, if it manifests itself such that they vote against the candidate, then in effect, they conduct...
For them personally, right? I mean, that sort of, it might feel that way. I don't think that, again, the idea is that the board doesn't get to overrule the superintendent in terms of recommendations for hire. The board doesn't get to substitute its perspective on that for the superintendent's. So as long as the recommendation is coming from the superintendent, and I understand what you're saying, right? There's some nuance to that, but as I said, there's a whole separate subsection on considering the chief school administrator's recommendation, which really is applicable to personnel matters, and it talks about what consideration the board has to give to those recommendations. So the other one, the other case that I think is interesting to talk about under this subsection is about volunteering. And so so this is an A, so it's an advisory opinion. So the SEC opined in response to a question that this particular board member would be in violation of the code if he regularly volunteered for a school club where he was going to have contact with and control over students, personnel, resources, administration, and that the volunteer activities would involve receiving orders from personnel and administration. And that in doing so, the board member would fail to confine their actions to policy-making, planning, and appraisal. So this is, I think, one of the quintessential examples of what is maybe not intuitive about the code of ethics, right? Schools rely on volunteers. It's great, it's well-intentioned, it's important. You guys are volunteers. You're elected officials, but you're volunteers, right? As last time I checked, nobody was making the big bucks for being here. Bruce can let me know if I'm wrong, if that's changed. So you guys fundamentally are volunteers, but this is really, and this is an issue that you'll see the SEC struggle with, when board members are parents, when they're community members, and when they're board members. You see this in some of the social media cases about when board members can have made a sufficient disclaimer, to give an opinion on their social media page or something like that, and when they're giving the perception that they're speaking as a board. These aren't bright lines. Same thing with volunteering. That's why I've got it underlined, regularly volunteering. If you want to go on a class trip with your kid's class, that's fine, right? If you're volunteering for something like that, they issued a pretty comprehensive advisory opinion a few years ago after this, where they went through specific positions, PTO treasurer, things like that, and they really looked at the level of connectivity and the level of interaction with students and the level of regular activity in terms of supervision over students and getting orders from administrators or giving orders to administrators. So it's an interesting one, number one, because I think it really highlights the fact that there are some things about this that are not intuitive, and with very good intentions, you could potentially, sort of trip over the code. But also this is an area where I think the SEC has struggled, and they've gone back and forth a little bit on some of these issues. So, no micromanaging. I will carry out my responsibility not to administer the schools, but together with my fellow board members to see that they are well run. Evidence of a violation there is that a board member gave a direct order to school personnel or became directly involved in the activities or functions that are the responsibility of the school personnel or the day-to-day administration of the school district or charter school. So I think that this one, we'll talk about the cases, right? So we have sort of a yin and a yang here in terms of the case notes. So C1420, a board member who raised concerns to administration over the complainant's conduct at high school baseball games didn't violate the code by then asking to be on the policy committee and then working to revise the board's policy, like basically on disruptive spectators. This is someone who was not in violation of the code and actually used their board position the proper way, went through the proper channels, and saw a problem, addressed it within their role through policy. Obviously, the complainant in that situation was not in agreement with that, was unhappy, felt like it was someone who was trying to micromanage, but actually board members' role is to create policy. The second case here, board member actually was in violation of the code and was actually censured because they tried to order the superintendent to allow a specific student to participate in graduation ceremonies. The superintendent had banned that student because there were very real safety concerns that were validated by local police, target of a shooting and potential threats that would have disrupted the graduation. So, and the board member was aware of that, by the way. There was no like, oh, hey, I didn't know. I don't know that that's actually relevant to the analysis here. I think that the point is that superintendents make those decisions and board members don't get to give orders to superintendents to overrule them. So in broad strokes, right, I think what we take from this is what the board's relationship with the superintendent is supposed to be, right? It's not a dictate, we don't dictate. And likewise, the superintendent does not alienate the board. This is a give and take. This is a conversation. This is your chief executive officer and you guys are the board of directors. So, when you think about what that relationship is supposed to be, that's to me what this portion of the code sort of speaks to. You're not second guessing, you're not micromanaging, you're trusting the administrators to do their work and that they're going to give you the information that you guys need to do your jobs. Yes, sir.
For the second point, what are the consequences for that board member other than that he was cited, or they were cited? Not
Censure, right. So, great question. Under the School Ethics Act, you can be reprimanded, you can be censured, you can be sanctioned. It's like reprimand, censured, suspended, or removed. There's also sort of a de minimis, they can decide that there was a violation, but it was like technical or de minimis, and they can impose no penalty. But when you are censured, I believe that's the second level. Sanctions are just private. Censure is actually when the board has to essentially like acknowledge the censure and post it on their website. Like there's some process for it. But you've hit on an issue that I think frustrates a lot of people, which is that what's the teeth behind this? Very rarely do you see removal. Very rarely do you see suspension. Most often you see sanction or censure, and I think that that's a recognition by the School Ethics Commission that most people do have good intentions here. And even when they don't, they should be given the opportunity to correct their behavior rather than being removed, which in some ways is sort of overruling the will of the electorate. But also, like I said, this is supposed to be instructive. This isn't supposed to be about discipline, about going after people for mistakes they've made. The code is supposed to be instructive to board members as to how to function in their position. Couple other cases here that I for some reason I always like this one. C-6406, board member violated the code. He basically just sort of walked around the school, took pictures of open windows and some problematic repair issues in the bathroom, and then spoke to reporters about it. So you've got two issues there. Number one, right? No one needs to be conducting site visits on their own. If you happen to be using a restroom and you notice something, then the proper protocol at that point is to let the superintendent know. And then, of course, speaking to reporters, you'll see later, right, that following the chain of command is something else that's one of the requirements for a board member, and that means referring things to the administration for administrative solution and not subverting that, such as going to reporters. Advisory opinion I put on here, just again, because I think it shows sort of the personnel issues here. Board members would violate the act by participating in an exit interview or even observing an exit interview, because that would breach the board member's obligation to refrain from becoming directly involved in activities that are the responsibility of school personnel and micromanaging school personnel. This is another one that's a little bit surprising. I think that there's room for opinion on what value we're getting out of exit interviews. I think in my view, where I land on it is that if you have a bunch of data from multiple exit interviews, that's probably something that can be shared with the board, but I don't think board members need to sit in on exit interviews. Board members have asked this question a number of times over the years out of concerns that staff members aren't going to be honest in exit interviews with various administrators in district, but that doesn't, so that's where that question comes from a lot, which I think is a fair concern. Not everyone is capable of being, sort of that direct with a recent employer, especially in a community like the education community where people move around, people from other districts, but nonetheless, it is still stepping outside of the role of a board member to get involved in that. Subsection E, I think we're halfway there, guys. I will recognize that authority rests with the Board of Education and will make no personal promises, nor take any private action that compromises the board. Okay, so this one's my favorite. We're going to talk about the second half of this. No personal promises, nor take private action. When we talk about evidence of a violation, we talk about case notes. We're going to focus on the second half. But because I want to talk about some big picture stuff, I really like the first half of this because I think it speaks directly to something that board members always have to keep in mind. I will recognize that authority rests with the Board of Education, okay? Not individual board members, with the Board of Education. You guys might have seen me, you might have seen this slide before, but humor me because I did watch too much TV in the 80s. So my touchstone for this is the beloved 80s cartoon, Voltron. So Voltron, what's that? I know. I didn't realize what a specific sort of cultural reference this is. This is like a very narrow time period of the 80s. But I don't know. It's what comes to mind. Okay, so these guys are space explorers inside those lions, and they explore space. And then when there's trouble, they form a robot, which is Voltron. And when the galaxy needs defending, right, that's who they are. So, like I said, I watched too much TV in the 80s. I still do, but I'm a grown up now and I can. But this is what I think of, and that's the picture I have in my mind, and that's the picture that I like to leave for board members, because that is what you guys are as a board. You are the mighty Voltron, right? You're the aggregate of several. And I think this is important because you guys are 9 sophisticated, experienced board members who come from different professions, different perspective, and from just different life experiences. And in order to function as a board, you have to reach consensus. You have to work together. That is not always easy, and it's only getting harder. There's a lot more. I think scrutiny, obviously, as you guys have experienced, and a lot more criticism of boards these days, and that makes it more difficult to sit up there and sort of accept that while recognizing that you're part of a whole and it's not personal. I also. Well, yeah, look, like I said, I've got to validate what I spent my childhood doing here, Mr. Charney. Right, but what about the little guys, right? And they look much more powerful. Well, it's true. It's true. Maybe the robotics team could work on something, Dr. Moore. I don't know, So I just think this is an important concept to keep in mind at a very basic level. The board functions through the will of the majority, but I think it's something to keep in mind. You can let yourself off the hook. You are one of 9. You are not the only decision maker here. You don't owe your personal opinion or anything as an individual to any person who sits in this audience. And that might feel a little controversial, but in a lot of ways it doesn't matter, because when you're up there, when you're acting as a board member, this is the box that you are in. And we recognize and we appreciate all of the different voices and opinions. But again, when you are functioning as a board member and as a board, this is what you are, a robot. That's exactly what the legislature meant. So anyway, thank you for giving me that moment. Now let's talk about the second half of this portion of the code, right? So this is about not taking personal promises or not making personal promises or taking private action that could compromise the board. So this is your evidence of a violation. Couple cases here, Asbury Park case, board members violated the code when they made personal promises to a candidate for an assistant superintendent, essentially by promising to advance the possibility of their employment. Like, hey, you interested in this job? If you are, go ahead, I'll make sure that you get an interview, right? Something along those lines, something that was beyond the purview of the board. So those were personal promises that no individual board member was empowered to make or authorized to make, that again, potentially had the possibility to compromise the board to the extent that created an expectation in that person or even something actionable. Second case, this should be pretty clear, but board member was in violation of the code and actually suspended for 6 months. I think that's why I like this case, because it's a suspension. You normally see that. During a traffic stop, this board member immediately identified themselves as a member of the Board of Education, called it a bleeping insult when they were asked for their license or registration, threatened to make a call to the council president, etc. School Ethics Commission was very offended by this and found that the immediate self-identification as a board member was an attempt to leverage their board position. So I regret to inform you that your board position does not get you out of tickets. So please obey the rules of the road. Yes, sir. Censured. Where is it? Censured. Yes. So reprimand, censure, suspension, removal. I'll double check that for you, but it's the second level of discipline from the SEC. And the initial one is just personal. It's a letter to the board member. The censure, I believe, is public. I think that the board has to actually acknowledge it publicly. So it's in sort of like the escalating penalties that the School Ethics Commission can impose. Exactly. All right, so subsection F, I will refuse to surrender my independent judgment to special interests or partisan political groups or to use the schools for personal gain or for the gain of friends. Evidence of a violation, pretty clear, took action at the request of a special interest group or use the schools to acquire some benefit for themselves or a member of their immediate family or a friend. So A2914, another advisory opinion. This is an interesting one, I think, because again, someone with very good intentions here. This was a board member who was also a local business owner who in the past had, in connection with the local education foundation, ran a fundraiser where they were splitting profits essentially from that board member's business, which were going to support the education foundation. Board member was savvy enough to request an advisory opinion before moving forward with that after they became a board member. And School Ethics Commission gave the opinion that would potentially be in violation of this subsection of the code because it could be perceived as sort of promoting their business through this, through their board position. So again, somebody with good intentions, someone savvy enough to ask the question in advance and got an answer that maybe they didn't expect. But again, this isn't personal morality. This is someone who wanted to do something good, not appropriate to do within the confines of what the legislature has designated as a Board of Education member's role. The second one I just like because, this is someone who is really committed to a vendetta here. And I'm Italian, so I like that. So this is a board member who was employed in district, terminated by the superintendent, filed ethics charges against the superintendent, and upon being elected, called for a vote of no confidence in the superintendent. And there was an advisory opinion on that, and that person was told that they would violate the act if they participated in the evaluation or any discussions, activities, and votes related to the employment of the superintendent. So we respect the commitment here, but we cannot allow it to move forward under these circumstances. G, I'll hold confidential on matters pertaining to schools, which if disclosed would needlessly injure individuals or the schools. So that one seems like a no-brainer, right? The second half of this is equally important. I'll provide accurate information in concert with my fellow board members and interpret to the staff the aspirations of the community for its school. I really like that. Interpret to the staff the aspirations of the community for its school. I think it's good language. Evidence of the violation is that a board member took action to make public information that wasn't public under any other law or that was otherwise kept confidential in accordance with normal board policies or procedures, or evidence that substantiates inaccuracy of information provided by the board member. And not only that it was inaccurate, but that the inaccuracy was the result of something other than mistake, personal opinion, or developing circumstances. So you have to be deliberate here. So this is a good opportunity to talk about social media cases. My two examples here do come from social media. Board member was censured for responding to and having a social media message reposted over an alleged student discipline incident. The message identified the student's school, grade level, gender, and specific details about the incident and what discipline was imposed. So basically someone had messaged a board member on social media, and in my mind, right, it went something like, hey, I heard that so-and-so, who is a 10th grader did this and this happened. The board member actually didn't respond directly to that person, but forwarded it to I don't know what the right word is, forwarded or like reposted it to a group chat with family members, also through the same social media platform. And then some of that person's family members shared it and shared it and shared it. And it was viewed as essentially that board member publicizing that information. And that was a censure. That was not just a reprimand. which I think reprimand and sanction is the word that I'm probably using interchangeably. But censure is definitely the more serious one, as evidenced by the second case here, where a board member was reprimanded because they inadvertently replied all to an email. So the fact pattern in here was a member of the community had emailed the entire board and the superintendent. The member of the community had either been in executive session or asked for something to be addressed in executive session. After that executive session, they sent the email and said, I just wanted to know if there's going to be any follow-up or something like that. And then the board member replied all, just sort of forgetting that the community member was on that email thread and intending to ask a question to board members and the superintendent, hey, are we going to readdress this? There was not any other information that was disclosed other than the fact that the board was probably going to discuss it again. And because it was inadvertent, that's why it was not a censure. So that at least tells us our censure is the second level, right? So it's a reprimand, I believe, for the first level. All right, here we go. As promised, subsection H, I will vote to appoint the best qualified personnel available after consideration of the recommendation of the Chief Administrative Officer. So this is our personnel section here. So evidence of a violation here is just that you acted on a personnel matter without a recommendation of the Chief Administrative Officer. So pretty much the only, we'll talk about the case notes in a second, but the only time where the board gets to act independent of a recommendation is following a Donaldson hearing if the board votes to reinstate someone who the superintendent did not recommend for renewal. And even that is sort of an indirect recommendation. So it just goes to show how strict and how tight this box is for board members. So
If in this case you didn't take the recommendation of the CSA and you voted just against it, would that be a violation as well? Because he did recommend the board didn't approve.
it would not. And so there has been some cases about that, both at the SEC level and also by folks who have been non-renewed over the recommendation of the superintendent. So what the SEC says about it, and this is our first case note up there, is basically just that the board members did not violate the code when they voted not to reappoint an employee despite the recommendation of the principal and the superintendent, and that the code doesn't require the board to accept all of the recommendations of the CSA. My apologies, Jeff. The board members, however, just must consider all recommendations and dismiss those that are arbitrary or capricious, which is a pretty high standard. Likewise, when the board acts contrary to the superintendent's recommendation on a renewal, the Commissioner of Education will also review that under the same standard, arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable. So was the board arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable in doing that? And that's a pretty high hurdle. Just high hurdle. Let's call it a hurdle. It's a high hurdle to clear, everyone, okay? So, so really what it comes down to is, and there are legitimate disputes sometimes. There are legitimate disagreements between what a superintendent is looking for in an employee and what feels good, what feels appropriate to a board. It's a whole different conversation, but the point is you're not bound, but your job is to take it seriously and to really look at it and make sure that you've given it all due consideration. Second case note under here, it's an advisory opinion. And again, no one loves this, but the SEC does not support board members conducting interviews for positions under the superintendent. Selecting candidates and making recommendations is the role of the superintendent, and prior to those recommendations, board members have no role in selecting candidates for positions other than that of the superintendent. And they even went so far to say, and this is the one that kind of makes everyone nervous, that the functioning of a personnel committee in any capacity invites the danger that the board may violate their obligations. I think almost every board I represent has a personnel or an HR committee, so I think that they swung a little bit far with that one, but I think the intention was using those committees as a way to make recommendations outside of what the board's purview is really what the invitation is. There are plenty of other personnel things, as you guys all know, right, that can be discussed appropriately and productively in a personnel committee. It's just not board members making recommendations for positions. Coming down to the end here, folks, I promise. I think there's two more. So subsection I will support and protect school personnel in proper performance of their duties. Evidence of the violation is basically just that a board member took deliberate action which resulted in undermining, opposing, compromising, or harming school personnel in the proper performance of their duties. You know, this is another one that I think is not necessarily intuitive. But publicly and as board members and up at the table and even in your personal interactions, it's outside of a board member's role to criticize or to undermine any staff member at school, not just the superintendent. You guys are here to support them, to make sure things are working well. It is the superintendent's purview to discipline, to counsel, all those sorts of things. So our case notes here, board member violated the code when he sent a letter to the superintendent copying the president of the state board and the executive county superintendent, basically accusing the superintendent of letting employees violate a board policy. And the second one, board member violated the code and was reprimanded when he asked a district employee whether they would be interested in the superintendent position if it opened up. Right? So that was shady on a couple levels there, but also a violation of the code. Outside the board member's responsibility, or outside of the board member's purview there, and certainly undermining the current CSA's authority. This one is interesting. I threw this one in. I know I've been doing 2 case notes, but this one's interesting because it came up in the context of an election. A board member was running for election and shared a post on her personal Facebook page that basically contained incorrect information and false allegations about a staff member who was running against the board member for a seat on the board. The board member, someone who the board member was connected to, I think it was Facebook, just someone had posted it and that board member shared it and said, please read. So very clear it wasn't a post authored by that board member, but it was shared on her personal page. And there were allegations that staff member who was running for the board, that person was a substitute, fully prepared to give up the position if they won the seat. It was just allegations of misconduct, and I think people were sort of conflating one well-known situation with this person, and I think this board member sharing it sort of added to that. So by sharing that inaccurate information, the board member failed to support district personnel. So it applies all the way down to substitute teachers, per diem employees. Shared incorrect information that needlessly injured that employee, because certainly coming from a board member, even if they were to make that disclaimer that, I'm sharing this as an individual, as a private citizen, not as a member of the board. When you share something like that as a board member, it doesn't matter what kind of a disclaimer you give. People are going to assume that you are in the know because you are a board member. So that's one of the other things that, especially during election season, you'll see the SEC kind of struggle with where that line is when you can take the hat off, how clearly you have to say, talking as a private citizen here. Reprimand. This is a reprimand. Correct, because the inaccurate information was that staff member had engaged in misconduct. So sharing inaccurate information was failing to support that staff member.
But if you mention that you're a board member and you claim First Amendment rights in speaking about anything, is that an oxymoron right there? What does the SEC view?
Yeah.
Because we've had board members from other districts
Yep.
declare themselves board members and start to undermine our policy.
Yeah. No, and so it's a great question, and I think it's one that the SEC, it's similar to volunteering. They're kind of closing in on a rule. You know what I mean? They haven't quite found the moment. At their last meeting, I was checking some of their recent cases. They dismissed a complaint against a board member who wrote a very clear disclaimer on their personal Facebook page before sharing an opinion. I don't know if it was on their Facebook page or if it was in a group message with a bunch of people. It was a surprising case because that board member was still speaking on a board issue. And so what you see is, like, when a board member speaks in their personal capacity on an issue, let's say it's unrelated to the school, unless what they've said is like so inflammatory or inciting violence or making there was one case where someone made some really, really terrible comments about a particular ethnic group. And the SEC determined that that was a violation of the code, because how could folks who were attending that school or members of that community come to the board and feel comfortable, you know what I mean, that they were being represented? So you have to go really far afield to be in violation of the code if you're not speaking on a school issue. I think when you're speaking on a school issue is where it's a lot harder to say, hey, look, I'm not speaking on behalf of the board. I'm just, you know, Joe Schmo, Jeff Carney here. This is my opinion. I don't know that you can magically take off that hat, but you don't give up your First Amendment rights. You absolutely don't. So what I always say is proceed with caution, and get another set of eyes on it.
What if they dispel inaccurate information and happen to mention that they're a board president, and direct our board to say, you can take action on this when we can?
Say that one again. Give me that one again.
So, board president comes and tells us that we can take action publicly on a security issue. We don't have to do it in private session. And introduces her position as a board president in another district.
Oh, when someone from another district, okay, comes in and speaks as a citizen at another board meeting and makes opines about, yeah. 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 I mean, look, it's, I don't know that that exact fact pattern has made it to the SEC. I think that, you know, you definitely get people, again, board members do not lose their First Amendment rights. And I think sometimes it's, you know, people give that caveat, you know, I've been a board member, I know what it's like, you know, I don't know that that's speaking on behalf of their board.
Why mention the fact that they're a board president at all? It's to elevate their standing.
It is.
And their supposed authority and knowledge in conveying inaccurate information.
Yeah, and so what I'll tell you, my gut there is that it is, it's less likely to be a violation of the code, but it's more akin to a governance issue. And there's some portions of what I'm going to talk about tonight that we're going to talk about in executive session. And one of those is sort of, it kind of touches on that. But I agree with you that when someone does that, their purpose is to give credibility to what they're saying. Now,
You don't see it as a violation, or the
I'm not sure what the personal gain is. I will say I don't think that the fact pattern has made it to the SEC. Based on how they've been deciding cases lately, they've been pretty narrow in some of these First Amendment cases. But I think, remember, so it's not just, it's about using your position, using the schools for personal gain. So although they are using their title or their elected office to sort of give more credibility to what they're saying, I don't know if that would satisfy the portion of the code that requires evidence that they used the school for their own gain or the gain of friends or immediate family.
telling us inaccurate information.
So if they're telling inaccurate information about what? About the law or about their school?
It's political gain.
I think it has to be actual gain. I think that's my sense of where I think the SEC would land on it, is that I think it has to be some sort of actual gain. It has to be, you know, someone they know, you know, like giving a favor to someone they know, or, you know, getting, or some benefit to a family member or themselves.
That's political gain. That's the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's an interesting question for the SEC to ask an advisory opinion.
We're not going to
there's that. Listen, I think, well, look, there's some professional courtesy, right? I mean, forget what the Code of Ethics says. You guys can have personal boundaries, beyond this, and that might mean recognizing that other districts function other ways, and, your opinion on how another district is handling an issue might not be welcome. Interesting issue, though, for sure. Interesting issue. Well, like I said, there is a... I will tell you, this is the final subsection of the Code of Ethics, right? So if there's any bright side in that. And this is the one that makes your lives easier. I will refer all complaints to the Chief Administrative Officer and will act on the complaints at public meetings only after failure of an administrative solution. So this is the one that I call let yourselves off the hook, right? You are just one of those lions in the mighty Voltron. You are not the mighty Voltron, right? You don't have to solve problems. You don't have to promise solutions. It's not your job to do so. Your job is to refer things back to the administration, specifically to the superintendent. So here's your evidence of a violation. No surprises there. But evidence that a board member acted on or attempted to resolve a complaint or conducted an investigation. So some of the cases, by the way, that I've referenced fall under a couple different subsections. So taking the pictures of the open windows and the problems in the bathroom also sort of, falls under here, conducting their own investigation. And that you did so prior to referral to the Chief Administrative Officer or at a time or place other than a public meeting, and prior to the failure of an administrative solution. So you have to give the process time to work. So I think these are pretty clear, the violations here. Board members went right to the principal in connection with a parent complaint rather than referring it first to the superintendent. And then the second one, basically the same thing, but a little bit more specifically deliberate. A board member went directly to other administrators to address issues that were raised to them in a letter from a member of the public because they didn't like how the superintendent was handling it. So board member is entitled to have that opinion, but doesn't get to necessarily act outside of their role as a board member and take it upon themselves to make different choices or to go to different people who they might get an answer from that they preferred. So, so keep this in mind, right? Keep this in mind. Keep the, the authority lies with the Board of Education concept in mind when people come up to you at the supermarket, when they email you, when they text you questions. You do not have to give answers or solutions. Take the information. It's almost like your intake. Take the information, let them know that you're going to pass it along to the superintendent and that they can expect follow-up. That's what you can offer. And you really can't offer anything beyond that. You can offer, they can follow up with you if you've not heard, if you don't hear with from the superintendent within a week, get back to me and I'll, get involved, right? And then you pick up the phone and you call, right? So, but this is how you do it. You guys don't have to take it upon yourselves. And again, I don't like to look at this as limiting and a thou shalt not. Like this is, let yourself off the hook. You don't have to solve these problems, not like especially not individually. Yeah, I mean, I think that especially when it's documented, when it's well-known information, I think it's okay to say stuff like that. I would always, just as a matter of course, let the superintendent know, and let the superintendent send that email. It's well-intentioned, and I think it's okay to say, in all likelihood, you'll be sort of referred back to the chain of command, and it'll eventually make its way up. But I'm going to send you the superintendent, and he'll direct you to your next steps. Just don't think about it. As a board member? Yeah, so it's a good question. Board members don't substantiate complaints at all. You send it to the superintendent and then he substantiates it. Yep. Yeah, and I'm not saying people are going to be okay with that, People are going to push you. People are going to want a different answer. People are going to say, yeah, I don't like the answer I've gotten, or, they're just going to give me the same old thing. Can't you do something, right? Or can't you give me a different answer? You guys don't investigate. You let the superintendent know. I mean, there are things, and look, you guys are members of the community. You don't have to be robots when you're talking to people that you know. You just have to be careful. Things that you can say are that, I will refer you to the superintendent. It will go from there. When people want to remain anonymous, I think you can tell them that that is not possible when there is, when there's something that may need to be investigated. Because I think that happens a lot. People come to board members and say, I don't want my name involved, but I heard blah, blah, blah. We can't take action on that. And sometimes the thing that follows the I don't want my name involved is problematic, and we have to follow up on it. And so in those situations, you don't get to keep someone's confidence. There are things that we are obligated to investigate and to follow up on. It all goes to the superintendent. And then whatever solution, it's okay to ask for follow-up. How did that go? Did you connect with that person? I think all of those things are fine. You're facilitators in that sense. But you don't have to substantiate or take any action on your own. Okay, so, all right. So a couple more slides just for the public portion. I can go through this one quickly because there was already fun discussion on that. So this was the one fun slide I had. Thanks, Jeff, for kind of stealing my thunder on this. Just a couple basic education law updates from what we've been seeing this year. This is one of the cool new things. Like we haven't gotten a lot of cool, fun new laws. I think this is going to be interesting. A lot of boards do already have a student representative, but I am sure that Central will forge a path that everyone will follow. And I think that there are a lot of ways that this could be really interesting and productive, especially coming out of a pandemic where student needs are different and kids are articulating them differently. So, new law, you guys already know about. I'll skip that. Couple of amendments to the HIB law. Most of this doesn't really impact what happens at the board level, but just as sort of an FYI. The amendments went into effect, I think, July 9th. It was like 180 days after it was adopted, which was sometime in January, so it'll be in place for this upcoming school year. There's some increased civil liability and fines for parents who demonstrate willful or wanton disregard in the supervision of a child in their custody who's been adjudicated delinquent for cyber harassment. So if you have a kid who, an adjudication is the juvenile court version of conviction. They're not convicted, they're not found guilty or innocent, they're adjudicated delinquent, which means they're in need of supervision, so there's some sort of follow-up to that. And so when parents aren't getting on board and when it seems like parents are just completely disregarding their child's online behavior that is cyber harassment, then they can have some of their own liability now. Yeah, I think that, no, I'm sorry. So it imposes look, some kind of civil liability has always existed. It's just made the theory a little bit more specific. And the fines, quite frankly, are not substantial, but it's a start. It's a start to sort of incentivize some follow-up by parents. And this law was like 2 or 3 years coming, these amendments, and some of where it ended up is really watered down from where it started. So appropriately so, in my opinion, in some areas. But that's, like I said, some of this doesn't really have to do with the board, but it kind of speaks to the intention behind some of this. So the intention was to strengthen some of the HIB laws. Remains to be seen. Intention and implementation in HIB has always been a little bit of a discord there. Yes, absolutely. They have to adjudicate them, yes, which is, again, the juvenile court version of guilty or innocent. It's just made by a judge instead of a jury. Correct, yep. Third or subsequent HIB findings now require individual student intervention plans developed by the principal and appropriate staff and approved by the superintendent, and may also require students accompanied by a parent or guardian to complete a class or a program to reduce HIB behavior. So another aspect of this that's kind of getting parents involved. The idea being that, I guess some people feel like parents are not policing what their kids are doing online, and when that becomes a pattern, we are now going to make them participate in some of the remedial measures here. Yeah, I tend to think that that is more of a disincentive than the $100 fine. If I had to harken back to my own childhood. And then the third bullet point, very general record-keeping requirements, but there's a lot of stuff the DOE is supposed to create numbered forms to kind of standardize the online HIB reporting process. And there's some new documentation requirements in terms of the principal needing to document exactly when parents are notified of the investigation. And if your policy is one of the policies that allows for the principal to make a preliminary determination of whether or not the case, assuming all the facts are true, meets the definition of HIB. So if you have one of those policies, it also creates some documentation where the principal has to document their finding there if they determine that it does not meet the criteria of HIB. Gives the superintendent some veto power over those as well to basically send it back and say, no, investigate it anyway. So just some record-keeping processes. So we've talked a lot about curriculum this year in our universe, as you guys all know. And I've been, it's forced me to understand a little bit better how this all flows. And so I've found this to be a fairly helpful explanation in some circumstances. So I just figured I would put a couple slides in here, just in the event that it helps any of you folks when you are hearing this, when you're articulating it for yourself. So we start up here with the law. The legislature gives the authority legislatively. It legislates the authority that it's delegating its authority to the DOE, to the Department of Education, to establish programs and guidelines for what must be taught in schools and what is required to graduate. So they delegate generally. They say, Department of Education, figure it out. Occasionally, they will legislate specific topics, and this runs the gamut. Cancer awareness, CPR, organ donation, gang violence. There's a whole list. More recently, as we've seen, the contributions of the LGBTQ+ community to history and the diversity, equity, inclusion stuff. So it is not new that they'll legislate specific topics, and really kind of all over the place when you look at the things that they've gone out of their way to address. So what flows from this authority that the DOE is granted are the New Jersey Student Learning Standards. So the DOE establishes these standards. It is not curriculum. And I think this is one of the misconceptions that I've sort of helped, it's helped me to kind of talk through this year and understand. The learning standards are like, I imagine them as pins in a map, right? This is where you have to end up, okay, by the end of 5th grade, by the end of 8th grade. So they are general concepts about what's to be taught and the performance standards that students are expected to master. What flows from that then at the local education authority level, the board level, is that curriculum is written by the district in alignment with the New Jersey Student Learning Standards. So, if we have our map analogy, we have pins on the map. The curriculum is like charting the course to get to those pins. And then drilling down further from curriculum is still pretty high up. Our unit plans, which might be 8 weeks of freshman English, and then lesson plans, which are what happens day to day in your kids' classes. And so there's discretion at every single level here. And I think it's just really important to keep in mind when there is so much concern about what happens in classrooms and these mandates and people having really different feelings across the board about all of this, is that there is quite a path to go from the legislature, from the learning standards to curriculum to unit plans to lesson plans, and there's no moment that necessarily where anything is dictated, where it has to be this curriculum or it has to be this lesson. Like I said, pins on a map, any different number of ways you can get there. And then the opt-out. This is, believe it or not, this was a law from the late 70s, I want to say 79 or 78, that allowed any student whose parent presents the principal with a signed statement that any instruction in health, family life education, or sex education is in conflict with their sincerely held religious beliefs, they can opt out without penalty. So this is not new. This is old. This has been around for 40 plus years at this point. And I think that recognizes that there's always been a range of opinions in terms of how comfortable parents feel with their kids being exposed to certain things in health and PE. And this creates that opt-out without penalty. So, regardless of how you feel about any of the debates around curriculum, this is the process, and I think it's helpful to know that, like I said, there's a long and winding road to get from the law to the classroom, and there's certainly this option for parents.
I think what that scenario is missing is the assessment piece. Because that, to me, if you present it in that fashion, certain members of the public will say, well, there's no mandate that we follow this curriculum. All it says it must be in alignment.
Right.
The real undercurrent.
So it's the performance standards, right? And that's where assessment comes in.
Right. But the consequences of not achieving the performance standards are financially and reputationally severe. And that the public doesn't see that. They see that as nebulous and room for them to impose what they feel should be taught instead or in place or not taught.
Well, and I think that the point here, right, in this sort of long and winding road is that there's a lot of different ways to get to those performance standards, and there are a lot of different ways for your curriculum to align with the student learning standards. Different districts are going to emphasize different units and different topics more in a more targeted way than other districts, and I think that you've already seen some of that across the state. What we know is that your curriculum has to be in alignment with the standards, and that is monitored through CUSAC. And, you know, back to our general discussion here on ethics, it's not just about CUSAC compliance. It's about standardization of assessment, standards, and learning. And that's one of the hallmarks of public education. So there's a general set of standards that every district in this state has to comply with, and then everyone gets their own local control, which is a substantial amount of control to write the curriculum that they feel is the most dynamic, instructive, and productive for their students. And that's going to look different district to district. So it's this great, you know, sort of meeting of the standardization across the state of public education in New Jersey, but also a substantial amount of local control in what that looks like. And that's, you know, that's where the rubber meets the road. I mean, jump in if you want, Dr. Moore, but that's where the magic happens, right? Yeah, I mean, not just saying, here's how we do algebra. Yeah.
And I look at that and I see that that's something that operates differently than our policy says, something that operates differently than what the law says, and also seems to present to me all kinds of equity concerns about access.
Yeah.
So if you're requiring somebody to opt in, there are parents who will pay attention to that, and there are parents who will not pay attention to that. So I see that as outside of the boundaries of what we ought to be allowed to do. Is that kind of the route that you would put on something like that?
I would. I mean, I think the law is very specific on an opt-out. What we can infer from there is that the default is that everyone is opted in. And I think that you can achieve the same thing. I think that you can achieve the same thing. Like there's some sort of point, I think, that people feel is being made by opt-in versus opt-out. But if we're looking at actually sort of making sure that parents are aware of what's being taught and their right to opt out, you can achieve that just as, you know, like in the same way. I think a lot of districts are moving toward having more of their curriculum available online, although that is a massive effort. Curriculum is not a small amount of information. You know, and I think especially in the K through 8 setting where, you know, there's maybe a different level of, or maybe sort of more fear and more sensitivity as to what kids in younger grades are being taught. You know, a lot of districts are being proactive about this is what this curriculum is going to look like. We're anticipating it coming up in the winter. We'll be in touch with you before then. You can, there are many ways to be, you know, open and transparent about what's going to be taught and to allow for that opt-out. Because I think to your point about equity concerns, the parents who want to opt out are going to be looking for that, right? And they're going to opt out, as opposed to the opt-in piece, which you and your administrative team would know better than anyone of how easy it is to get 100% response on any sort of, form that needs to be signed or anything. So yeah, I mean, I think that the very fact that there is a law for opting out, to me, suggests that the default is that everyone is opted in. Yeah. Right, right. Standard across the state, and then you guys get to do your own magic here locally as to what it looks like.
And this provision covers very specific, there's also a provision, by the way, for dissecting animals.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that one.
This provision would not cover someone objecting to contributions of LGBTQ+ in history.
Yeah, that is correct. And that's deliberate, by the way. The purpose of that law was to infuse those concepts across different subject areas and not to silo it. So we don't just have Black History Month, right? The contributions of folks from various subgroups, are all year round and cross-curricular. I don't know what the right way to put that is, but very specifically, I mean, that law was written to require it to be infused through a number of subjects. The opt-out is specific to health, family life education, and sex education. So it's not, like I think I heard evolution over here, right? We can't opt out of that. You can't just opt out of, I don't believe in algebra. I would have tried that. So the opt-out is really specific to things that pertain to moral or religious beliefs that are sincerely and deeply held. And again, you can achieve, I think, the same sort of parity for folks who really do want to opt out, just by communication and letting them know when there are going to be things in the curriculum that that they may want to consider. Yeah, that's not legislated. It's just that there's no penalty, so they don't receive any grade loss or any sort of loss of credit for graduation. I think for the most part, you would find another activity for them to do so that they have another, like if there's an assessment that they end up missing out on, you don't want them to lose the opportunity for another assessment. If there's a certain number of assessments that you do per unit or per semester or per quarter. But that's something that would happen at the administrative level.
Force a student to read something that they were in opposition to or that their family was in opposition to. We'll work with parents in this, but that sits outside of this.
And under 18, this is the parents. So there's a conflict between parents and students.
Good question. Yeah, that is a tough one.
Does that happen? Have you had that happen where like a student wants to sit in on something and parents say no?
It's rare that we see these kinds of situations in the senior year at all. So I can't cite any specific kind of example of that here.
No, I meant more like a younger student.
Yeah,
Like a 15 or 16-year-old wanting to participate.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, so the parents opting out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it reads the parents. Now, again, I think in context, this was either a 1978 or 1978 enactment. Since then there have been some movement towards 16, 17, 18-year-olds having a little bit more autonomy in certain areas. So I don't know how this would be viewed, but it says parent. So it feels to me like parents get the final say under this. But it's nothing I've ever researched. It would be an interesting to consider. Okay, so that was the end of what I had for public session. There's a couple just sort of standalone topics that I know came from Lisa polling the board that I wanted to touch on in executive session that are a little bit more under the guise of legal advice and advisory, consultative, or deliberative. So we just had our questions and discussions. There's, yeah. Okay.